On October 14, 1947, a small rocket-powered plane flown by a 24-year-old Air Force captain flew into history over the high desert of California, breaking what is known as the sound barrier for the first time. Now, there are plenty of documentaries on the subject already made by much more informed and capable creators out there, but I wanted to give you a relatively short rundown of Chuck Yeager's famous flight into history. Before we can delve into that October day, we need to understand why the effort was needed. It's been known for a long time that sound travels via air particles similar to waves in water. If you've ever seen a firework from a long distance, you'll notice there's a delay in what you see versus when you hear it. That's because sound travels much slower than what we visually perceive. But how fast does sound travel? A physicist by the name of Ernst Mach developed a formula in 1887 just to measure that. I've always sucked with math, so you're better off looking at that part up on your own, but Mach's formula was dubbed the Mach number, with Mach 1 equaling the speed of sound. Generally speaking, the speed of sound at sea level is approximately 760 miles per hour. Now you're probably thinking, oh, but Falcon, what do you mean approximately? So Mach 1 is not a fixed number. As air gets thinner based on altitude and other atmospheric influences, the speed of sound decreases. A good way to look at it is the higher you go, the slower sound travels, until you get to space where there's no air and thus there's no sound. So great, cool, we know what the speed of sound is. But what stops an object from going past it? Now here's where we run into problems. Remember how I mentioned that sound moves in a similar fashion to water waves? When an object, say a plane, approaches Mach 1, those waves tend to slap back onto it. For most planes, those shockwaves slam into control surfaces, i.e. things that allow you to go up, down, left, right, etc. You know, the important things. This became a huge problem in World War II when fast fighters would end up in steep dives and get control locked. If the pilot couldn't slow down, the plane was likely to break up in midair, if not just slam into the ground. It's not very cash money for aircraft developers who always aim for faster flying birds. No matter what was done, the problem persisted. And even when jet technology was developed, new fighters like the P-80 encountered what was eventually dubbed the sound barrier. As early as December 1944, the U.S. Army Air Corps and the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, also known as NACA, decided it had to be broken. As World War II drew to a close, the Army Air Corps ordered the development of a small rocket-powered research plane. By 1946, the Bell Aircraft Company in Buffalo, New York, go Bills, had developed the XS-1, which was shaped like a .50 caliber bullet and stuffed from nose to tail with fuel and research equipment. The XS-1, later renamed X-1, could take off from the ground, but with only a 2-minute and 30-second flight time, was made to fit in the bomb bay of a B-29 Superfortress. Once at 22,000 feet, the X-1 would be dropped from the bomb shackles and burst off in a rocket-powered climb to 40,000 feet. After that, it would level off, and a little orange plane would then move to break the sound barrier. But what about the shockwaves freezing the controls I brought up earlier? It was discovered that an all-moving tail, known as an adjustable horizontal stabilizer, would remain effective under the onslaught of shockwaves and should allow the pilot to maintain pitch control. But that was yet to be proven. And there's a bit of drama involving the NACA and the Air Force over the program, which I really encourage you to look into, but by 1947, the X-1 was sent to Muroc Airfield in California, a small base commanded by Colonel Albert Boyd, who was charged with assigning a pilot to the X-1. No small feat given the task at hand. So who would it be? The man for the job was none other than Captain Chuck Yeager, who at the age of 24 already had an amazing resume in the field. In World War II, Yeager downed 10 aircraft, 5 of them in a single day. This is even after he had been shot down in early 1944, evaded capture by the Germans, and with the help of French resistance fighters, made it back to Allied lines and begged to be put back in the air. Hell, this guy even shot down one of the early German jet fighters, the Me-262. This guy was a badass. After the war, he was assigned to Muroc to test captured German aircraft in addition to experimental US-built jets. It's almost as though he was tailor-made to fly the X-1. By October 14th of 1947, after multiple test flights in the X-1 that proved the all-moving tail would maintain control, the little orange plane was hoisted once more into the B-29, flown by Roberto Cardenas, with flight engineer Jack Ridley in the jump seat. Yeager was ready to climb into the X-1 as he had done so frequently, but this time there was a problem. So 2 nights before, Yeager and his wife Glennis had finished dinner at Poncho's, a popular bar and horse ranch owned by famed aviatrix Poncho Barnes. Why not go for a little horse ride? The two decided, no problem. All was well until Chuck's horse ran him into a gate which threw him to the ground and broke a pair of ribs. Awesome. Yeager decided he absolutely could not tell anyone about the accident, lest he lose the X-1, and he decided to go to a local veterinarian instead of an actual people doctor. The problem now is that due to having a literal broken bone in his body, Chuck couldn't properly lock the X-1's hatch. That is until Jack Ridley came to the rescue with an advanced solution. A broom handle. Yeah. And once inside the X-1, he was able to lash the door shut. Just jammed it into the mechanism and lashed it shut. Cool. Problem solved. Fast forward to 22,000 feet. After a countdown from 3, the X-1 was dropped into the blue California sky once more. And like every time before, the rockets were lit, the plane climbed to 40,000 feet and started accelerating. This time, the X-1 reached Mach 0.98, faster than it had been yet. The aircraft vibrated as the supersonic shockwaves rapped against the tail, and then the Mach meter in Yeager's cockpit jumped. A telltale sonic boom echoed across the desert, a result of the plane passing through its own shockwave and the resulting vacuum in its wake slapping shut like a massive bubble. Yeager and the rest of the X-1 team had done it. The sound barrier was broken.
DW, read to headquarters. Sound barrier broken. What's my next mission, General?
Not only did the US Air Force now possess the knowledge necessary to safely pass through the sound barrier, it had the technology. Unfortunately for the aviation media crowd, it wasn't until 1948 that the US admitted to having gone supersonic, as there was concern the new foe, the Soviet Union, would try to get their commie mitts on the data. The concern was well founded too, as the Soviets were developing high-speed aircraft of their own. The now proven all-moving tail was adapted for use on the F-86 Sabre, which later gave it an edge over the Soviet-built MiG-15s when maneuvering at high speed in the Korean War. In addition, the all-moving tail, redubbed the Stabulator, became standard on all high-performance aircraft as they were developed. In a few short years, the idea of a sound barrier had been extinguished. The demon that was ripping planes out of the sky had been beaten by the knowledge and courage of man. Sonic booms became routine over the California desert, and if you go out there today, you might just hear one yourself. Well, that's all for today. If you're interested in reading more on the subject, I highly recommend Chasing the Demon by Dan Hampton. It's a fantastic book which goes more into detail on the history of the program and other distinguished men involved. I also want to give a shout out to my wingman Hellion, who was kind enough to lend art to this project. You guys just have to check out his Patreon, Hellion Manor. You can find a link to it in the description below. And by the way, I'm always looking to learn too, so if you think I might have made an error or something, let me know in the comments. You already know the drill about liking and subscribing, so I won't waste your time on that. And remember guys, keep the sun at your back. What do these two fighter planes have in common? I'll give you a second. They both fought with machine guns. For the first 45 years of air combat, guns were the tool of choice. Of course, as aircraft got faster and flew higher, something had to change. Today, we'll go over the birth of the weapon that changed air combat forever, the Sidewinder missile. Let's rewind to World War II. Both the Axis and Allies were bombing the shit out of each other, and fighters were tasked with intercepting them as well as their own escort fighters. As it turns out, machine guns and cannons are a bit hard to kill other aircraft with. There are a lot of factors that go into hitting, let alone killing a straight flying bomber. Not only do you need to line up for a gun solution, preferably from the rear, you have to take into account wind, G-forces affecting your fired rounds, and return fire from your target, and the list really goes on. The idea of a guided weapon was being tossed around during this time. The Germans were developing a wire-guided missile called the Ruhrstahl X4. Using a remote control in the cockpit, the idea was for the pilot to fly the missile into the proximity of an Allied bomber, where it would detonate via a proximity fuse. This, of course, required the pilot of the fighter to fly straight and level whilst guiding the missile, which is a really dangerous thing to do while under fire. After the end of World War II, the US Navy decided it wanted a true fire-and-forget air-to-air missile that didn't require further pilot input after squeezing the trigger. In 1946, the Naval Ordnance Test Station, or NOTS, at Inyokern, California, began a project to develop a guided aerial rocket. The project, headed by William McLean, was initially dubbed Local Fuse Project 602, however by 1951, a more apt name was chosen: Sidewinder. The namesake is based upon the missile's seeking system, which tracked heat sources in a similar manner to the Sidewinder, a North American rattlesnake that relies on heat-sensing organs to hunt warm-blooded prey. Throughout the 1950s, the prototype missiles were tested by both the US Navy at Inyokern, which was redubbed China Lake, and the US Air Force at Holloman Air Dev Center, with the first successful drone kill taking place on September 11, 1953. The US military knew it had a winner, and via subcontractors Raytheon, General Electric, and Philco Ford, the missile was put into operational use by 1956. Locking onto a target and shooting was a relatively simple process. The pilot of the fighter would point the infrared seeker at a target, and well, US Air Force ace Robin Olds describes it best.
The Sidewinder looks at the IR signature of an airplane, the heat waves, and it speaks to you. It kind of mumbles. Then if it sees a good heat source, it goes.
With a good growling tone in the pilot's headset, he would know to take a shot. Simple, effective, and relatively cheap. Of course, the missile had yet to see any combat. On the other side of the world in 1958, the Communist People's Republic of China and the Western-backed Republic of China, also known as Taiwan, were duking it out over the Taiwan Strait. The Taiwanese ROCAF was equipped with the American-built F-86 Sabre, while the PLAF had Soviet-built MiG-15s and MiG-17s. I won't get into the details of the conflict as this video would be over an hour long, but as always, I really do encourage you to research more on your end. Anyway, back to the Sabres and MiGs. The US Navy and Marine Corps wanted to have the ROCAF test the new Sidewinder in the field. Via the clandestine Operation Black Magic, 4 Sabres were modified to operate the AIM-9B, the first production variant of the Sidewinder. On September 24, 1958, a flight of 8 Sabres led by Leng Pei-Shu sortied, with half of the flight acting as high-altitude bait while the Sidewinder shooters hung out at lower altitude, ready to bust any MiGs that fell for the ruse. On that day, 4 MiG-15s were trapped. Taking the bait, 2 pairs of MiGs climbed at the high flight, giving the shooters a good view of their hot engines against the blue sky. At the end of the day, the ROCAF boys claimed 4 kills. The Communists admitted to 2 losses themselves and 1 damaged aircraft. The Sidewinder had drawn blood, and the US military was pleased. For the next several years, fighter doctrine revolved around the reliance on missiles like the AIM-9. By 1965, when the US ended up in the Vietnam War, things would get a little bit more interesting. But that's going to require a whole video series of its own, which we'll get to sometime. Until then, support Hellions Patreon if you're interested in the artwork shown in these videos, and you know what to do with the liking and subscribing. As always, I'm looking to learn too, so if I got something wrong or you disagree, let me know in the comments. I'd love to talk with you about it. Alright, keep the sun to your backs, guys. Have a good one. In 1946, the Naval Ordnance Test Section, or NOTS, at Angukarn Even if you're not watching this on October 31st, just pretend it's Halloween. So, we're gonna go back to the late 1990s when I was a little falcon having a camp out with my friend V. And by camp out, I mean we were like 6 setting up a dome tent in my parents' yard. Out comes my dad, who sat in the tent with us to tell us some spooky stories he picked up from his time in the Air Force as a security policeman. Yeah, security forces were called security police back in 19... Yeah, security forces were called security police back in the 1980s, whatever. At Whiteman Air Force Base in the 1960s, silos for Minuteman ballistic missiles were being built. This involved an 80-foot some-odd shaft being dug into the ground, which was then lined with concrete. Now, apparently, one of the contractors who was put on this job went missing, and he was never found. There was no reason for him to actually, go anywhere. I mean, this is Missouri. These are flat hills and, just open farmland. So everybody was kind of like, what? Now, about 20 years later, missile technicians would have to go into the silos for routine checks to make sure the missiles were functional and whatnot. And in one silo, the techs would routinely hear the clacking sound of a hammer against concrete. It didn't take long for the guys to put 2 and 2 together. The contractor who disappeared fell into the cement and drowned, and his spirit was struggling to break free by hammering at the concrete. I wrote a creepypasta on this one like 10 years ago, don't read it. Another mysterious denizen was allegedly some kind of Sasquatch or werewolf that hopped atop one of the guard towers at RAF Lakenheath and began slashing at the roof with its claws. And it was only stopped when the poor bastard inside unloaded a full auto burst from his M16 into the ceiling, prompting the apparition to buzz off into the distance. Honestly, I would have done the same. And the third story was set at Andersen Air Force Base in Guam. During World War II, an Army Air Force chaplain was killed by a Japanese holdout sniper as he stood on the flight line watching B-29 bombers take off on combat missions. Years later, when the base was home to B-52s, security police guys would see an officer wearing an old, out-of-regulation uniform pacing on the flight line watching the bombers do their thing. And as the guys would get close to him, he would disappear as though he was never there. Is there any actual credence to these stories? None that I found on the internet. Honestly, these stories are probably fabricated by bored guys out in the missile fields in between radio checks, but I like to think that every story, especially the spooky ones, have a kernel of truth in them. If you're someone who's heard any of these stories before, I implore you to post in the comments, and if you have a story of your own, let us know. It's Halloween after all, and the time is right for cracking a brew and having a good tale. Have a happy Halloween, guys, and make sure you check your children's candy, because you might find something awesome in it if my social media is to be believed. Have a good one.
Falcon, what did you do?
I just asked a question! Alright guys, before you douse my home in kerosene for doubting the supremacy of the aircraft-mounted gun, hear me out. The gun has served air forces of the world greatly for 90 plus years, and this is not advocating for the removal of them. I mean, let's be real. Who doesn't love the sight of a 6-barreled Vulcan cannon spitting out flame like a dragon, with 60 rounds per second ripping into a MiG and shredding it in pieces like a tin can? Ugh. But I want to ask you guys, How often does that happen? Since the Vietnam War, out of 50 recorded air-to-air kills by the US Air Force and Navy, only 2 were gun kills performed by A-10s against HIP helicopters, and in case you didn't know, the A-10 is not designed for air-to-air combat. Of course, here and there you'll find the occasional gun kill in a third world conflict among small prop jobs, but one really has to think, how important is the gun in the modern arena? I'll let you decide that for yourselves at the end. To understand the reason for everyone having such a hard-on over the aircraft-mounted gun, we have to look back at the first time its relevance was called into question. In the 1950s, the primary threats to American coastlines and carrier fleets were Soviet bombers like the Tu-95 Bear. As such, the emphasis on dogfighting with other fighters was taken over by fast-flying missile-wielding interceptors. The F-4 Phantom, a personal favorite of mine, was a flying brick designed to fly as fast as possible and deploy its Sparrow missiles at up to some 20 miles, which neared the beyond visual range. Of course, you don't want to wait for the bombers to get within range of their own cruise missiles, so fuel space was a premium, as was a large radar for painting targets at long range. Because the fighting was supposed to take place in these environments, the Navy's Mark IV cannon was omitted. We all have to remember that hindsight is 20/20, so when the F-4 was the primary fighter for the Air Force and Navy, it found itself in a fight it really wasn't designed for: the skies of Vietnam. Vietnam is a tropical and mountainous environment, a far cry from the flat oceans where the Air Force and Navy anticipated its next war. The BVR rules discussed prior were rendered useless not only by the terrain, but by the rules of engagement. When you're in an air war over land, you have a ton of assets from both sides flying in and out of the combat zone. Not only do you have Allied bombers hitting targets, you have helicopters dropping off troops, and cargo planes dropping off, Agent Orange? One step to deal with the issues of BVR fighting was Identification Friend or Foe, or IFF, which was a transponder that flashed a certain frequency that tracking systems would be able to pick up on. If you flashed the right code, you'd be painted as a friendly. Simple, right? Well, not in the 1960s. Not only did not everyone get an IFF transponder, but reliability was in question. The last thing an Air Force wants to do is kill a friendly, so what was the solution? Well, spotting targets visually. So you had an F-4 Phantom, designed to fight at 20 miles, being brought in close so the pilots had to pick out individual aircraft like MiGs or, who was a friendly and who wasn't. This is where it gets fun. The Soviet-built MiGs used by the North Vietnamese were built for this arena. Up close, the Sparrow and Sidewinder missiles could still engage, but required specific envelopes for a good shot. For example, this heat-seeking Sidewinder required a pilot to be on the ass end of a MiG for a good tone. Sparrows could shoot from the front quarter, but the speed of the two aircraft merging only gave the F-4 crews mere seconds to lock on amongst the mountains and jungle clutter, and take a shot before the oncoming MiG was in the minimum engagement range for the missile to even detonate. Meanwhile, the more maneuverable MiG-17s and 21s had little trouble engaging with their cannons, while the fast and slow-turning F-4s fought at a handicap. The Air Force's solution to close-in dogfighting was the Su-16 gun pod, a 20mm cannon that replaced the centerline fuel tank. The Su-16 wasn't even linked to the F-4's gun sight, so the pilots had to basically make hip shots cowboy style to make a kill. They had to spray and pray. Later systems did show up, and the Air Force did end up with several MiG kills via cannon, so it's easy to accept the idea that the gun was the solution to the problem. But it's a little more complicated than that. The US Navy went its own route and developed Top Gun, which focused more on dogfighting tactics using against the communist MiGs. Navy F-4s never received a gun, but their kill ratio increased dramatically, and I think that deserves a video on its own. Regardless, the idea that the gun was the king of close combat was cemented even to this day. Every air combat aircraft after the F-4 had provisions for a gun as to not repeat the losses in Vietnam. Alright, here we go. Invoking the name Pierre Sprey these days is essentially the Godwin's Law of aviation history nerds. You know what? We're not even gonna go there. The revisionists like the late Mr. Sprey were frauds who had no actual influence over the development of modern military aircraft, despite all they said and the pull they had over the uninformed masses. We're gonna skip this one. Next. 1991, Desert Storm. IFF tech had been improved, and the success of the Sparrow missile really shined as the superfighter that is the F-15 Eagle mowed down MiG-21s, 25s, and 29s. While the rules of engagement still persisted, the IFF improvements allowed F-15s to make longer-range shots they needed, and even when they ended up in visual range dogfights, better Sidewinder missiles allowed for kills during maneuvering once thought impossible in the 1960s. As we went over before, the only 2 gun kills were done by A-10s, which lacked much in the way of air-to-air capabilities, so the gun truly was the only choice in the matter. Even then, they wrecked a pair of Mi-8 hips, which is a feat on its own, but a far cry away from supersonic gun kills of Nam. Honestly, after 1991, the only jet air-to-air gun kill I can find any documentation of is a Venezuelan F-16A shooting down an OV-10 Bronco in 1992, which has some great video documentation. And since then, it's been 30 years, hard to believe. There's not been an instance of jet fighters using an internal cannon to shoot down another aircraft. Of course, it is important to note that through the Great War on Terror, guns have been known to be used for ground attack and strafing very extensively. However, these were often situations where no other weapon was at the disposal of the aircraft called upon. For example, an F-14D Super Tomcat flown by J. Faceshot Consalvi was called upon to do a strafing run in support of coalition forces in 2004. I just want to note that this is the only time the F-14 fired its gun in anger over the course of its 35 years of US service. And before you say, "Oh, Falcon, what about Iran?" The only other user of the F-14, Iran, used its gun once in 1980 to down an Mi-25 Hind versus 144 missile kills over the course of 8 years. Anyway, back to it. So gun kills with jets are only getting rarer and rarer as technology improves. So we have to wonder, does carrying a 250-pound M61 Gatling cannon and its near ton of ammunition make sense anymore when the space could be used for more advanced sensors or jamming equipment? I would personally say the gun should not be carried at the expense of, say, an IRST sensor, but that doesn't necessarily mean we should go ripping out cannons from our planes. Missile technology, especially in the AIM-120 AMRAAM and the AIM-9X Sidewinder, provided engagement envelopes never before imagined in the 1960s. Forget shooting at 20 miles for a BVR kill, think of something closer to about 80 to 100 miles. Even if you get close enough for within visual range engagement, the AIM-9X Sidewinder can shoot a target at all aspects, and when coupled with a helmet-mounted display, can reliably nail an enemy aircraft with the pilot looking over his shoulder 90 degrees. The days of having to maneuver onto a target's tail for a missile shot a la Vietnam are long gone. I won't say the gun has no place in a dogfight, but the idea of it as a primary weapon is basically over. If anything, it's a last-ditch weapon for use in an oh shit moment. Think of it this way. A soldier or marine on the ground has a rifle and a limited amount of space on his kit to stock ammunition, communication gear, first aid, water, etc. A pistol as a backup to his rifle takes up valuable real estate. Now, if you're able to carry a sidearm without the expense of leaving important equipment behind, great. But if you end up using that sidearm, you or someone else is fucked up royally. You've used all your rifle ammunition, any artillery support you've had, any tank support you've had, it's all failed. It's just you and a pistol against a guy. This is why the F-35B and C variants lack an internally mounted gun. The B model needs the space for a lift fan, and the C needs extra fuel being an aircraft carrier variant. Now, if the situation calls for a gun to be necessary, they do have the option to take an external gun pod with them. However, I've seen very few images of them being equipped with them at the fleet. Anyway, that was a long one, and like always, I do suggest you to read into these things on your own. If you think I'm wrong, I'd like to see what you have to say, and maybe we can learn something together. Also, if you enjoyed the artwork done by Hellion Manor, the link to the Patreon is in the description. I'm Falcon, and thanks for watching, and as always, keep the sun at your back. "1952, the skies of North Korea. Lieutenant Elmer Royce Williams of VF 781 Pacemakers would soon find himself in a life-or-death struggle against not one or two, but 7 MiG-15s in the midst of the Korean War. The engagement would make history, even though it would be classified for the next 50 years. Royce Williams was born on April 4, 1925 in South Dakota. From an early age, he had the dream to fly. After December 7, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, Williams enlisted in the U.S. Navy and attended the Naval Academy in Pensacola, Florida. While he missed seeing combat in World War II, he trained to fly the Grumman F-9F, and was eventually assigned to the aircraft carrier Oriskany. Part of Task Force 77, the Oriskany was bound for the Korean Peninsula in support of UN forces fighting the Communists aiding North Korea. Royce's steed, the F-9F, was a straight-winged carrier jet built by the famous Grumman Iron Works in Bethpage, New York, the same company that would later build the best fighter ever made, the F-14 Tomcat. Like all previous Grumman Navy fighters like the Wildcat, Hellcat, and Bearcat, the F-9F was named after a cat, the Panther. The sturdy jet was armed with 4 20mm cannons and had 8 hardpoints for carrying bombs and rockets of all sorts. By 1952, the straight-winged arrangement of the Panther was seen as obsolete, as swept-wing jets like the Soviet MiG-15 were able to reach near the speed of sound, while the Panther was stuck at a max speed of around 500 knots. In fact, the Soviet MiG-15 used by the Communists in the Korean War outclassed the Panther in almost every category. It had larger cannons, a higher top speed, and was just as rugged as the Grumman Cat. When Lieutenant Williams sortied on November 18, 1952, the cards were already stacked against him. Royce was already on his second sortie of the day with a flight of 4 when his flight lead, Lieutenant Elwood, reported mechanical trouble and had to turn back with his wingman. Williams and his remaining wingman, John Middleton, were left alone to continue the combat air patrol. The Oriskany's radar then picked up a flight of unknown aircraft coming from the direction of Vladivostok, and Williams was ordered to intercept them before they came into range of the carrier battle group. Williams and Middleton climbed and spotted 7 contrails at approximately 50,000 feet. The only fighters in the Communist inventory that could fly that high were MiG-15s. The MiGs dove on the pair of Panthers who had little chance of running away. Even though they were told to not engage, Williams and Middleton were forced to defend themselves. Within seconds, the MiGs and Panthers were at the merge. The 23 and 37mm guns on the MiG-15s banged away, sending baseball-sized tracers at the blue fighters. The Americans fired a burst at an oncoming MiG-15, shaving bits away and setting it off in a smoke trail. Middleton, the young lieutenant junior grade, dove after the MiG, intent on finishing it off. He lined up a shot and was ready to shoot again when nothing happened. All 4 of Middleton's cannons had jammed. Williams ordered his wingman to break contact and run for home, leaving him alone against 6 MiGs circling about him like sharks. The furball swirled as Royce's Panther jinked and evaded. In the flurry, the Panther had one advantage over the faster MiGs. It could turn inside them. Every time a MiG-15 dove on him, Williams was able to force an overshoot, and eventually he was able to get a shot in. As one of the silver jets crossed in front of him, Royce squeezed the trigger and a burst of American lead slammed into the attacker. The shells buried themselves into the MiG's aluminum skin and detonated, blowing the fighter out of the sky and sending it spiraling into the sea. MiG after MiG continued their slashing attacks on Williams, their own cannons blowing holes into the Panther, but he didn't give up. Moments later, a second MiG fell to the Panther's claws. One MiG-15 tried a head-on pass on Williams, who pulled into the oncoming threat and let loose with the last of his ammunition. The deadly shells found their mark, blasting into the MiG's intake and causing the engine to explode. Post-production Falcon here. I want to make a tiny correction for one of my fuck-ups in this. So documentation on the dogfight varies in the order of which the kills happen. However, according to Royce himself, the head-on pass was not his final victory, and according to him, he believes his cannon rounds hit the cockpit, not the intake, and where the engine is. Anyway, back to it. Now out of ammo, and the remaining MiGs still pursuing him, Royce tried to break into the clouds. Before he could find safe haven in the cloud bank, a cannon burst blew a hole in the Panther's tail, turning the engine and control system into a mess of twisted pipes and cables. Despite the damage, Williams disappeared into the white clouds and into safety. Even though it was Swiss cheesed, Williams was able to nurse his crippled Panther back to the boat. In the flurry of combat, 263 holes had been punched into the resilient Cat, which had to be written off and pushed over the edge of the Oriskany. One would think that Williams would be hailed by the Western media as a hero. Not since World War II had the US Navy achieved such a victory in aerial combat, but the whole event was put under wraps. The MiG-15s that had been engaged by VF-781 weren't North Korean or Chinese as had been commonly encountered by US forces in the Korean War. They were Russian. In 1952, there was a fear that if Russians engaging the US became public knowledge, the conflict would intensify and a new war between the US and Soviet Union would be sparked. Unfortunately for Lieutenant Williams, he couldn't even talk about the engagement for the next 50 years, but he was awarded the Silver Star. It was only in 2002 that the dogfight became common knowledge, and Royce was given public credit for his accomplishment. Royce Williams achieved the rank of captain over the course of his 37 years of service. Not only did he fly in Vietnam, but he also commanded the USS El Dorado, and he ended up retiring in 1980. Just this year in 2023, Captain Williams was recognized by the Secretary of the Navy, Carlos del Toro, and his Silver Star was upgraded to the Navy Cross, the second highest award in the Navy. The 97-year-old now resides in Escondido, California. If you're interested in learning more about Captain Williams' story, check out John Mollison's documentary, Actions Speak Louder Than Medals, the Royce Williams story. As always, if you enjoyed the artwork done in this video, check out my wingman Hellions Patreon. It's pretty friggin' good, and there's something there for everyone. I'm Falcon, thanks for watching, and keep that sun at your back, guys. The year is 2002. Jimmy Neutron is showing on Nickelodeon, George Bush signed the No Child Left Behind Act, and Ace Combat 4 Shattered Skies is less than a year old. Across the pond in Iraq, after 8 years of tension, a MiG-25 of the Iraqi Air Force took to the skies to meet its opponent for an historic event. What set this apart from every other air combat engagement in history is that the MiG's foe had no flesh and blood in the cockpit. It was a drone. We all know the story of the MiG-25 Foxbat, a mysterious Mach 3 Soviet interceptor that struck fear into the hearts of the West. Hell, its mere existence prompted the development of the F-15 Eagle, a still viable fighter 50 years after its inception. Despite all the gloss though, the MiG-25 turned out to be a steel brick with wings and a pair of big fuck-off engines. The curtain was gone after Viktor Belenko, a Soviet pilot, defected, and while it wasn't a super fighter like the MiG-31 in the movie Firefox, it could still shed some blood. In Desert Storm, an Iraqi MiG-25 was able to down an F-18 Hornet flown by Michael Scott Spiker, who was believed to either have been killed on impact by the missile or after bailing out of his stricken aircraft. In addition, the Foxbat downed numerous Iranian aircraft in the Iran-Iraq War. In 1987, a MiG was even able to down an F-14 Tomcat, which really hurts my soul, but as we all know, history is not nice. Despite not being a super fighter, the Foxbat could kill and had the notches on its belt to prove it. No one could have imagined what its next opponent in 2002 would be, though. Let's jump on over to the good old US of A for a lesser-known aircraft. In the early 1990s, a light propeller-driven aircraft known as Amber was constructed by Leading Systems LLC, a small aircraft company started by Israeli-born Abraham Karim. The CIA became invested in the drone due to its quiet engine, and felt it would be a good surveillance drone eventually if it was able to be developed further. This spawned the Gnat, of which 5 examples were built. Eventually, the General Atomics Company formed an aviation branch and took on the project. By 1994, the MQ-1 Predator was developed, a remote-controlled drone designed for reconnaissance. By the year 2000, the Predator had teeth to go with its eyes. Provisions for Hellfire missiles had been given to the aircraft for attacking ground targets, and Stinger missiles were also equipped for air threats. Even though it was a drone with maneuverability and speed on par with a Great War Sopwith Camel, the Predator now had a very modern weapons suite that could be controlled from thousands of miles away. 2002 marked 11 years since the Persian Gulf War, after which NATO enforced a no-fly zone over Iraqi airspace via the Operation Southern Watch. Over the course of this time period, the Iraqi Air Force challenged the zone several times, most notably December 27, 1992. A MiG-25 of the Iraqi Air Force was shot down by an F-16 Viper wielding the new AIM-120 AMRAAM. Almost 10 years to that date, on December 23, 2002, a Predator from the 15th Reconnaissance Squadron took off on a recon mission over Iraq. In response, a MiG-25 was sent up for an intercept. What transpired was actually rather unsurprising. The MiG-25 closed in at high speed from the front quarter and shot a missile at the slow prop job. While the Predator was able to get a stinger of its own off, it was baited by the heat signature of the incoming missile and went off course. As seen in the footage from the Predator here, the unmanned wonder was then blown out of the sky and turned into scrap. At face value, the fight is pretty uneventful, but truly was the first time a remote-controlled aircraft engaged a piloted fighter. Of course, it really would not be the last. As far as the MiG-25s go, Saddam Hussein ordered his remaining air force to be buried and preserved in the desert sand to be covertly dug up and flown later. However, during the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, a majority of the Foxbats were uncovered and captured. Not gonna lie though, I still like to think there are a few waiting beneath the desert sands to be dug up and found someday. So now we have the Predator. Whatever your thoughts on the Iraq War are, the white drone really did become a symbol of the GWAT just as much as the UH-1 Huey helicopter was a trademark of the Vietnam War. So now we're living in the hellscape that is 2023, and the world is just as, if not more chaotic than it was 20 years ago. Over in Ukraine, we have reports of drones being used by both the Ukrainian military and the Russian invaders. This is the hottest peer-to-peer conflict we've seen since World War II, and with that comes modern technology butting heads. Hell, we've even seen a Ukrainian MiG-29 pilot, Major Vadim Voroshilov, posting a bloodied selfie after getting into a fight with a 5-ship of Iranian Shahed drones. Apparently, the MiG-29 ended up going down after technical complications. 20 bucks he rammed one of them. I mean, it really does take balls to take a selfie when descending in a parachute, not gonna lie. We probably won't know all of the true stories coming out of Eastern Europe for quite a while, but I can promise you that we'll see more unmanned aerial combat, that's for sure. Okay. So this is completely off script, and this is literally happening just as I was recording this video, but apparently an F-22 from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina just clapped a Chinese spy drone balloon setup. There's gonna be more information on this in the description, but I mean, it's kind of eerie how relevant this is. I want to close this out by reminding you guys that while during these engagements, the drones were destroyed and no lives are lost in the combat, but they really are designed to do the same job as their piloted brethren are, to destroy the enemy. Alrighty then, well, you guys know the drill. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more, subscribe and comment, and if you didn't, I can really still learn from your comments. It's part of the whole improving through feedback thing. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out my Wingman Hellions Patreon, it really is as baller as always. Thanks for watching guys, and keep that sun at your back, flyboy. See you next time.
I'll give you a call to come in and hook on. Are you ready to come in and hook on anytime? Sir, Club 1, Roger, we're ready anytime you are.
Imagine you're in a small, bell-shaped capsule a little larger than a refrigerator. Now imagine that capsule is bobbing like a cork in the Atlantic Ocean, with waves blotting out the sun through the small window above your head. You might feel claustrophobic, maybe even overheated as you power down the capsule and the cooling system running through your silver pressure suit. You know that it won't be long until you're able to taste fresh air again as the recovery choppers close in. And you would feel the sensation of fresh air on your face, but only after a sharp thud awakens you from your trance. Light pours into your glorified can, and with it the onrush of salt water. This is exactly what an American astronaut experienced on July 21st, 1961. Now there are many names well known through history books and schools alike, and I'm sure you've heard them too. Neil Armstrong, John Glenn, Buzz Aldrin. But many don't know about the second American who ventured into space, Air Force Captain Gus Grissom. Only the third human to ever cross into space, behind Yuri Gagarin and Alan Shepard, Grissom's suborbital hop was a nearly flawless flight, until moments before his capsule was recovered by helicopter. My channel normally deals in flight, but strap yourselves in, gang, because we're punching through the sky, into space, and back again as we follow Gus Grissom's fateful flight in Liberty Bell 7. The origins of the space race have been done to death in various videos, so I'll keep this part relatively short. And by relatively short, we just have to go back a couple thousand years. Modern humans have something very much in common with our caveman ancestors. We both looked up at the stars and moon at night. While of course we have a much better understanding now of celestial bodies, as far back as ancient China we've been trying to figure out ways to explore everything above us. In 2000 BC, or so the legend goes, a Mandarin official named Wan Hu attempted to climb to the stars on a chair packed with black powder-fired rockets. Honestly, this doesn't really make all that much sense, given gunpowder was invented almost 3,000 years later, but I digress. The point is, if he was real, he probably didn't make it into space, but points for trying. Modern space travel concepts really got rolling in the 19th century. Stories such as A Trip to the Moon by Jules Verne depicted American scientists, yeah that's right, traveling to the moon by cramming themselves in a giant cannon round, which was then fired at the moon? Okay, so fast forward a bit. Robert Goddard, an American scientist, improved rocket designs, and Germany went on a vacation from 1939 to 1945 when they developed the V-2 ballistic missile. I mean, the peaceful A-4 rocket designed for scientific exploration. After said vacation, many of the German scientists decided they wanted to move to the US instead of the Soviet Union because White Sands missile range is better for tanning than the gulags of Siberia. Werner von Braun, notable nice guy who had no ties to the Allgemeine SS or any form of forced labor in pursuit of his rocket development, helped Redstone Armory develop the PGM-11 Redstone, an intermediate-range ballistic missile designed to rain nukes on our red-aligned neighbors across the pond. In fact, if you go back through the development of the Redstone, it was an almost direct descendant of the V-2. On the other side of the world, the Soviet Union wanted to further their own rocket development, and with their own captured German scientists under supervision of Sergei Korolev, came up with the R-7 missile. Both the East and West had military ambitions for the missiles, but not just to deliver nuclear payloads. The concept of satellites had been floating around for several years to improve communication, spy on the other side, and act as orbital platforms to drop nukes.
Like rocks from a highway overpass.
Hell, in World War II, von Braun even had the idea of putting men into space and setting them up in a giant rotating space station for military and scientific purposes. The thing looked like a giant wagon wheel and would have spun at a rate enough to generate artificial gravity. You could tell he was passionate about this idea into the 1950s too. I mean, just look at this old Disney show about spaceflight.
Even though there's no apparent motion, everything in the orbit is hurtling around the Earth at 16,000 miles per hour. The shell of the station is completed.
Oh man, Disney used to be so cool. Anyway, on October 4th, 1957, the Soviets, admittedly, beat us to space with their first satellite, Sputnik 1. This beach ball-sized satellite didn't really do anything so much as prove that they could put an object in orbit, as Sputnik only operated as a radio transmitter, pumping out a consistent and incessant communist beeping. A lot of people suggest that this is the moment where the space race really started, as America and the Soviets kept putting up more complex satellites, some of them containing animals, several of which didn't come home. As the world's attention turned to spaceflight, the question in everyone's mind was, when would we send a man up? And hell, what would we even call him? Established in 1958, the fledgling National Air and Space Administration, better known as NASA, began Project Mercury, a program aimed at putting an American in orbit. The big question at the time was what kind of people would be sent into space? Daredevils? Scientists? NASA determined that the right kind of person they would need to bear the risk was a military test pilot. With good reason too, as test pilots are already accustomed to danger, complex technology, and they have an excellent grasp on the fundamentals of aviation. In December of that year, NASA's Space Task Group coined the term astronaut for the new type of pilot, a contraction of aeronaut for air traveler and astro for stars. Star traveler. The first 7 astronauts were handpicked from a pool of Air Force, Marine, and Navy pilots. On April 9th, Scott Carpenter, Gordon Cooper, John Glenn, Gus Grissom, Wally Schirra, Alan Shepard, and Deke Slayton were publicly announced to be the initial team of astronauts sent into space. Throughout 1959 and 1960, the astronauts trained relentlessly for every eventuality, practicing in-flight emergencies, water evacuations, and worse, how to handle the American news media. You see, the American space program was very different from the Soviet space program. Instead of being a state secret in which anonymity of the pilot was vital to cover up any possible accidents, NASA's program put a spotlight on the Mercury 7 to gain nationwide interest. Interest builds capital, after all. By the way, join my Discord. By 1961, it was decided that the first 2 space flights would be undertaken in modified Redstone missiles as suborbital hops to test if man could even function in space for a short 15-minute flight. Hell, if Ham the chimpanzee could do it as he did on January 31st, 1961, why couldn't a test pilot? Of course, what would America's first Star Voyagers ride in? Okay, so first off, I want to make something very clear.
That is a spacecraft, sir. We do not refer to it as a capsule. Spacecraft.
The Mercury spacecraft, manufactured by the McDonnell Aircraft Corporation, was a bell-shaped cone large enough for a single occupant. The astronaut would lie on his back toward the bottom of the craft, where a composite heat shield lay. This would shield the spacecraft and astronaut from the intense friction that builds up during re-entry into the atmosphere. The nose of the craft was equipped with an escape tower that would be jettisoned after reaching space, radio equipment, and a parachute among other various gadgets. Boosted into a suborbital hop by the Redstone, the initial mission profile of the Mercury was to rotate 180 degrees so the pilot could observe the Earth and conduct maneuvering tests with vernier boosters positioned around the craft. At the Mercury's apogee of 116 miles up, the spacecraft would engage a retro rocket package that would slow it down to a rate where gravity would do the rest. The Mercury was designed to perform a water landing or splashdown, where the spacecraft and crew could be recovered either by helicopter or ship. But how would the astronaut get out? The initial Mercury design featured 2 forms of egress. The primary method was a hatch to the astronaut's side which opened via a lug system. The emergency escape system on the Block 1 spacecraft was through the nose. The control panel would have to be unbolted and moved aside to access an emergency escape hatch, from which the astronaut would push the parachute casing through the narrow recovery ring. The astronauts, with Grissom at the helm, pushed for an explosive bolt system to be installed in the primary hatch. In an emergency, the astronaut would remove a safety wire and hit a plunger that would detonate a series of 70 explosive bolts and jettison the hatch in less than a second. He would then escape the craft with ease. Of course, this is under the taut cable of a helicopter, but we'll get to that. The first manned flight of Mercury Redstone was planned for early 1961, but a booster test on March 28th pushed the flight back to April 25th. Regardless, Alan Shepard was to take the reins. April 12, 1961. Vostok 1 with cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin lifted off from Baikonur Cosmodrome. The Soviets elected to cover up the first manned spaceflight while it took place, lest they get egg on their faces if it failed. Gagarin performed several orbits of the Earth, and after nearly dying in a re-entry malfunction where the service module of the Vostok capsule didn't properly separate from the crew capsule, he somehow landed safely in Soviet territory and was made a hero. Okay, Yuri had some nuts doing this. I'm not trying to take anything away from him. The point is, the Soviets beat the US, as much as I hate to admit it. Needless to say, the Mercury 7 was raging to go, and on the 25th of April, Mercury Redstone 3, dubbed Freedom 7, was set to launch. The second manned flight into space went off without a hitch. Shepard's suborbital hop, while a far cry from the Soviets' orbital flight, was successful, paving the way for the upgraded Mercury to make a flight of its own in preparation for the more complex NASA missions. Grissom, chosen for Mercury Redstone 4, readied himself for launch on July 21st of 1961. His mission was simple: launch from Cape Canaveral, achieve an apogee of over 100 miles, and return to Earth while ensuring the revised Mercury capsule would be suitable for the orbital flights the rest of the 7 would undertake. Mercury capsule number 11, fresh off McDonnell's production line in St. Louis, Missouri, was placed atop the mighty Redstone rocket and transported to Launch Complex 5. Grissom adorned Capsule 11 with a white crack paint scheme and the name Liberty Bell 7 to echo the motif of American values that Freedom 7 had. The thing did look like a bell, after all. At 12:20 UTC, Liberty Bell 7, with Grissom at the controls, shot into the sky.
Ignition, lift off, lift off.
Liberty Bell 7 performed its mission flawlessly, albeit with Grissom taking a moment to experience the beauty of spaceflight that until then only 2 others had seen.
Roger, you're on the window. Are you trying a yaw maneuver? I'm trying a yaw maneuver and I'm on the window. It's such a fascinating view out the window, you just can't help but look out that way. The jet is jettisoned. Now I can see the Cape. Roger.
As Liberty Bell fell from her apogee, Grissom experienced over 10 Gs of force, 10 times the force of gravity. As the spacecraft entered the atmosphere and began to slow, the McDonnell-built rivets held, the heat shield kept Grissom from cooking alive, and the parachute popped to life, slowing the bell.
Main chute is good. Main chute is good. Rate of descent coming down. Coming down to, there's 40 feet per second.
Off the Florida coast, the aircraft carrier USS Randolph launched Marine Seahorse helicopters in anticipation for recovery. The lead helicopter, call sign Hunt Club 1, was piloted by Jim Lewis, who spotted the spacecraft in the air under parachute. As it approached the sea, Liberty Bell deployed a landing bag, a perforated curtain dangling from the bottom of the spacecraft. Not only would it help cushion the impact, it would then act as a sea anchor to help keep the bell vertical amidst the churning waves.
Getting ready for impact here. You can see the water coming right on up. Liberty Bell 7, this is Atlantic Capcom. Do you read me? Over.
Splashdown went without a hitch, and Liberty Bell's whip antenna deployed successfully, improving communications with the recovery team. The recovery process for Mercury spacecraft was a bit more complex than simply clamping on a cable. First, the whip antenna had to be severed by the helicopter's crew chief, who would then run a pole out to a recovery loop on the spacecraft's upper ring. At the tip of the pole was a carabiner that would snap onto the recovery loop and allow the Seahorse to lift the craft several feet out of the water. When safely above the waves, the hatch would be opened, a good opportunity to test the explosive bolts. As Hunt Club 1 slowed to a hover to cut the whip antenna, something went horribly wrong. The hatch blew off to skip along the waves like a stone. Unsecured, Liberty Bell 7 immediately began to take on water. At this point, Grissom had unplugged himself from the capsule and rolled out into the sea. The US Navy-designed Mark IV pressure suit was designed to be watertight to allow the astronaut to float. However, in his haste, Grissom had left a connection valve open. This let water begin to flood his silver suit, which acted as an anchor in his body. As Grissom struggled with the sea, Hunt Club 1 was able to latch onto the foundering Liberty Bell. Unfortunately, the Seahorse wasn't equipped to handle the weight of a 4,000-pound sea anchor weighing it down, and it too was almost lost as the recovery cable snapped taut, pulling the Marine helicopter into the water. Lewis fought hard, lifting the waterlogged spacecraft out of the water, but every time it seemed as though the battle was over, a wave would swamp the open hatch and drag it back down. The overloaded engine of the Seahorse choked as metal shavings entered the oil system. Lewis feared not just losing Hunt Club 1, but the thought of the helicopter crashing down onto the struggling astronaut. Meanwhile, a second Hunt Club helicopter dropped a horse collar to Grissom, who was pulled to safety. Hunt Club 1, with its engine screaming, prompted Lewis to order the recovery cable severed. Liberty Bell 7 was cut from the Seahorse. Liberty Bell 7, despite being a spacecraft made for flying outside of the atmosphere, met a similar fate to the Titanic, having been swallowed by the Atlantic Ocean. It was suggested that Grissom, having survived the ordeal, punched out too early before Hunt Club was able to connect. Gus and his astronaut brethren scoffed at such suggestions. Fellow pilot Wally Schirra tested the explosive hatch after his mission on Sigma 7, which produced a deep bruise on his wrist from the explosive plunger's recoil. Gus had no such markings on his body. So if Grissom didn't engage the hatch, then what caused the accident? Many theories abound. One of the 70 explosive bolts on the hatch was found to be faulty, but it was left in place. However, it's very unlikely that this was at fault. A more likely scenario is that static electricity arced from the helicopter as they attempted to lash onto Liberty Bell. This would have triggered the explosives in the hatch and fired it. A concrete reason has never really been found, even to this day, and Liberty Bell lay in the depths of the Atlantic, in darkness. 38 years later, in 1999, an expedition led by Kurt Newport discovered the resting place of Liberty Bell. Deeper than the Titanic, the Mercury craft lay right side up, no doubt a result of the anchor-like landing bag. Despite the loss of a remote-operated vehicle in rough seas, on July 20th, 1999, exactly 30 years to the day that Apollo 11 landed on the Moon, Liberty Bell 7 was pulled from the sea. NASA pad crewman and former Luftwaffe night fighter flight engineer Gunther Wendt was present, laying eyes on the craft 38 years since he last saw it. Jim Lewis, the helicopter pilot who almost saved Liberty Bell, was also present. The one man who should have been there, though, to see the recovery wasn't. Grissom had perished 29 years prior in the Apollo 1 accident, which also claimed the lives of Ed White and Roger Chaffee. An ironic twist of fate is that the Apollo spacecraft had an intricate hatch which lacked any quick-release system. This trapped the trio inside as a fire sparked in the pure oxygen environment. It was over for them in less than 14 seconds. Liberty Bell 7, having undergone an extensive restoration procedure, now lies in the Cosmosphere in Hutchinson, Kansas for all to see. Despite being underwater for 38 years, it was actually really well preserved and only shows minor damage. Before the 1999 recovery, Kodak, the manufacturer of the pilot observation camera, held the belief that the film that captured Grissom's flight could be recovered as well and shed light on the accident. Unfortunately, this idea was quickly dispelled as the film canister had burst deep underwater, ruining any hope for any concrete evidence. I do want to make one final addition here. In 1983, the film The Right Stuff depicted the loss of Liberty Bell 7. I personally want to speak out on this depiction of Grissom as played by Fred Ward. In the scene, Gus is depicted as having a near panic attack and losing his cool. This heavily contrasts the calm and collected Grissom in real life, who was a true professional on and off the radio. Many today believe that if his life wasn't claimed in the Apollo 1 accident, Grissom would have been among the first on the Moon. And despite having never gone to the Moon himself, Gus is up there. On the Moon's far side, a crater was named for the man who devoted his life to the stars, Grissom Crater. Thank you all for watching this video on a topic near and dear to me. It seems almost yesterday that I watched the Discovery Channel Search for Liberty Bell 7 documentary that detailed the recovery efforts that would bring Grissom's lost craft to the surface. I urge you all to watch this doc in full. I also want to thank Hellion for the art assets in this video. As always, they really did turn out great. And finally, for the first time, a very special thanks to my patrons, whose support helps bankroll videos like this. It really does mean a lot and helps keep me motivated to keep pumping these out. For you at home, keep that sun at your back, guys. Have a good one. Supercarriers are among the largest man-made moving objects in the world. Despite having a lifespan of close to 50 years, supercarriers do eventually have to be decommissioned. When that happens, where do these massive ships go to die? Most are broken up for scrap, where some of the parts are repurposed for other ships. One carrier, however, met a very, very different fate. She was destroyed by the very navy that she served. This is the story of the final mission for USS America. Before we delve into the destruction of America, I want to go over the evolution of the aircraft carriers that led to her creation. While many ships throughout history serviced and recovered aircraft, most commonly seaplane tenders, the first dedicated aircraft carrier in history was HMS Argus. Argus was a converted ocean liner commissioned on September 16, 1918, thus making her the only active carrier in the Great War, even though she was too late to see any combat as the war ended on November 11th of that year. Argus featured a long, flat flight deck for launching and recovering Sopwith Sea Strutter biplanes. In these early days of carrier operations, propeller-driven aircraft were able to launch without any catapult assistance. Turning the ship into the wind was sufficient for aircraft to gain enough lift to take off under their own power. Recovering aircraft was less simple. Argus was equipped with a series of wires that would engage a hook on the underside of an aircraft. The system is still in use today, albeit with modernizations. The first American carrier, USS Langley, was commissioned in 1922, just 4 years after Argus. She was equipped with a gunpowder-fired catapult to aid in launching increasingly heavier aircraft. Again, another hallmark of carriers still seen today. Of course, now we use steam and electromagnetic catapults instead of gunpowder. World War II saw the greatest use of aircraft carriers in combat. Both the Axis and Allies operated numerous examples, which still relied on the arrangement first pioneered by Argus and Langley, straight decks for both launching and recovering aircraft. The next innovation in carrier design was the angled deck, once again developed by our besties in the UK. You see, recovering aircraft on a straight deck required the pilot to either land correctly the first time or smash into parked aircraft on the forward part of the deck. There was no way to go around if the tailhook missed a wire, which often led to disastrous consequences. The angled deck allowed aircraft at the bow to either lay parked or launch, while simultaneously allowing incoming planes to be recovered. If the pilot missed the wires, he could simply power up again and go around unobstructed. HMS Centaur was the first ship to employ this arrangement, which became standard on every subsequent fleet carrier in the US Navy. A carrier employing a catapult in addition to a wired recovery system is called a catabar carrier, which stands for Catapult Assisted Takeoff Barrier Arrested Recovery. While there are other types of carriers employing ski jumps and lacking cables, we'll be focusing on the catabar arrangement moving forward. The term supercarrier is reserved for the largest of aircraft carriers. First coined in 1938 by the New York Times in reference to HMS Ark Royal, there's no concrete definition of the nickname. Since the US Forrestal class, the term has been applied to every American fleet carrier as they have consistently been the largest vessels of the type. In 1960, USS Kitty Hawk was commissioned. She was the first of her class and also bore the nickname supercarrier. Throughout the 1960s, 4 of her kind were commissioned: USS Kitty Hawk, USS Constellation, USS America, and USS John F. Kennedy, which was seen as a subclass given several changes to her design. USS America was the third of the Kitty Hawk class. Launched on February 1st, 1964, just over 3 weeks before Mr. Falcon Sr. was born, she was commissioned in January of the following year. The massive ship displaced 61,174 long tons and had a length of 990 feet. America could accommodate up to 80 aircraft and had a complement of over 5,000 men. The warship was powered by 8 boilers driving a 4-pack of Westinghouse steam turbines, which could push the Titan to a swift 34 knots. Just for reference, this is like if you put the 70 Pine building in New York City on its side and drove it at a speed of like 39 miles an hour or 62 kilometers an hour. I'm not even allowed to drive a Jeep through my hometown that fast. I mean, I do it sometimes anyway, but you know. America's first cruise took her to the Mediterranean Sea in 1965, where she took part in Fair Game 4, a Franco-American war game to simulate defending against an attack on a NATO ally. While she spent most of her time in the Atlantic and the Med, America was sent to Yankee Station off the coast of Vietnam from 1968 to 1972. Over the course of 3 cruises, she received 5 battle stars for her actions in the Vietnam War. Notably, it was her A-7 Corsairs that destroyed the Thanh Hoa Bridge in 1972. Having been dislodged and partially collapsed by laser-guided bombs dropped by the Air Force on May 13th of 1972, U.S. Command ordered a follow-up strike by the Navy. On October 6th, Corsairs from VA-82 Marauders dealt the killing blow to the mighty Vietnamese bridge with walleye-guided bombs. The impact severed the bridge in 2 and collapsed it completely into the Song Ma River. After Vietnam, America was involved in numerous conflicts in the Med, most notably the 1986 Libyan conflict. You see, the conflict in Libya was sparked by tensions with the dictator of the country, Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi, who funded terrorist activities including the hijacking of TWA Flight 847 in 1985. In March of '86, Gaddafi declared crossing into the Gulf of Sidra to be crossing the line of death. Any ships or aircraft crossing into the Gulf would be considered targets by the Libyan military. Operation Detain Document was kicked off by the US as a show of force given that the majority of the Gulf was considered international waters. USS Coral Sea and USS Saratoga were joined by America that same month, bolstering the force standing against the Libyan aggression. The carriers formed a sort of skirmish line from east to west about 150 miles north of Gaddafi's line of death, ready to stomp out any aggression towards friendly ships passing through the Gulf. Throughout March, the two sides butted heads, but no blood was shed. Tensions came to a head, though, on March 24th when a trio of US ships led by USS Ticonderoga crossed the line of death. Air cover was launched to protect the warships, including a formation of F-14 Tomcats, EA-6B Prowlers, and A-7 Corsairs. In response, several SA-5 surface-to-air missiles were fired at a pair of F-14s from VF-102, only to be jammed by an EA-6B Prowler's electronic warfare suite. A pair of MiG-25 Foxbacks was sent up after the group, and a pair of VF-33 Tomcats warded them off without firing a shot. Given the hostilities, America launched A-6 intruders as part of a combined strike on the Libyan defenses. The first airstrikes occurred when VA-34 and VA-85 intruders destroyed the Libyan patrol boat Wahid. Meanwhile, A-7 Corsairs conducted a seed flight to kill the SA-5 sites around the city of Sirte. Over the course of the 24th, continued American strikes disabled another pair of patrol boats, and even an Anuchka-class corvette, which was sunk by A-6s in a harpoon strike. The American task force took no casualties that day. Less than a month later, as part of Operation El Dorado Canyon, America launched a dozen A-6s and A-7s as part of a combined Air Force and Navy strike to further cripple the Libyan military. This is in response to the La Belle nightclub being bombed in West Berlin, which killed 3 people, including an American serviceman, and injured 229. The 6 intruders and 6 Corsairs went downtown over Benghazi, striking parked aircraft and air defenses to make way for Air Force F-111 strikes. Again, no Navy personnel were lost, however a lone F-111 was down in the strike, killing Captains Fernando Rivas Dominici and Paul Lawrence. While the cause of the loss is up for debate, it's likely that the Aardvark was downed by a Soviet-built surface-to-air missile. The Swift America was among the last of her kind, as conventional propulsion gave way for nuclear power in the form of USS Enterprise and the Nimitz class. However, she still served well into the 1990s. In 1990, America deployed to the Persian Gulf. This time she would partake in Operation Desert Shield against the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. On January 17th, Operation Desert Shield became Desert Storm as Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein refused to pull his forces out of Kuwait. President George H.W. Bush ordered a full-scale strike on Iraqi forces, starting the Persian Gulf War. Once again, Carrier Air Wing 1 launched combat sorties to strike ammunition depots, bridges, and mobile Scud launchers. The unrelenting strikes lasted for over 3 weeks until the ground war began. As the ground war began, the scope of the mission changed to support coalition forces pushing into Iraq and Kuwait. 100 hours after the ground war had begun, Kuwait was liberated from the invaders and the war was ended with the ceasefire order. America made several other deployments into the 1990s, however by 1995 she was showing her age, and the decision was made to decommission her in 1996 due to budget cuts. On August 9th, she was put in the Ready Reserve Fleet in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Instead of being scrapped as initially planned, the US Navy elected to add America to the roster of SINKEX targets. SINKEX, short for Sinking Exercise, is a program that allows the Navy to test anti-ship weapons like torpedoes, missiles, etc. Until the 2000s, the Navy had sunk plenty of retired destroyers, frigates, and even aircraft carriers. However, they had yet to sink any carrier newer than an Essex-class carrier from World War II. While there were some objections to sinking a ship with the namesake America, the Navy put her on the chopping block to test various weapons. In addition, the SINKEX testing would help naval designers learn ways to improve subsequent carrier designs to better protect the crew. As much as I hate to see a ship named America sunk, the logic was sound. America would be sacrificed to improve safety and damage control on future boats in one final mission. She wouldn't be scrapped, she wouldn't be sold, and she wouldn't become a museum ship. She would go out in a blaze of glory to protect the lives of American sailors in the future. But how does one sink something as large as a supercarrier? Nothing of this scale had ever been intentionally sunk before. Despite being an old boat, the America was still structurally as sound as she was when she launched in the 60s. This really would not be as simple as blasting her with a Mark 48 torpedo like smaller destroyers. So what does it take to sink something as big as a New York skyscraper? Well, I know just the guy to call. My friend at Submariner Touchdown Bane. Hold on, let me dial him up real fast.
Making turns for 10 knots, maneuvering out.
Bane, it's Falcon.
Oh, hey, Falcon.
Hey, so I know you're probably super busy right now.
Fire the VLS.
But I'm doing this little video on SyncX, and I was wondering what it takes to kill a carrier. Like, can you tell me how America was sunk?
No, dumbass, it's classified.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Real talk, folks. Do you think the Navy wants to advertise how to sink one of its modern supercarriers? Of course it's going to be classified. In fact, only one image of the America sinking has been revealed, and it really doesn't show us much. I really don't even want to speculate on how one would sink a US Navy carrier, because, honestly, it's better that we don't know. That being said, if we have the know-how to sink a US carrier, then something like, I don't know, the Russian Admiral Kuznetsov should be no problem if the ship box doesn't sink itself, as it consistently tries to do on an almost yearly basis. America was sunk on May 14, 2005. Now, the Navy was kind enough to give us the location of where she lay on the seafloor, but good luck getting there as she's 16,860 feet down. Fun fact, that's over 4,000 feet deeper than the Titanic. The sacrifice America made has had an impact on the design of Gerald R. Ford carriers coming into service. However, what these improvements are is, again, classified. And that being said, I think I'll call it here. A special thanks goes out to Touchdown Bane, who was kind enough to lend his voice to this video, as well as my Top Gun graduate patrons who volunteered their voices to act as the subcrew. I know I glossed over a few details about America, but I do urge you guys to talk about her further in the comments. She really was an amazing ship. If you want to support myself and Hellion, my beloved artist and partner in crime, check out our Patreons in the description below. It really does help me keep these videos pumping out. Now, I know it's hard to say goodbye, but it's only for a little bit because I've got plenty more content planned. One more thing, if you're watching this in the daytime, go look out at that sun as a reminder to keep it at your back. I'll see you around. Bailing out is one of the last things an aviator wants to do. I don't care what the situation is. It's a hard pill to swallow when the decision has to be made to abandon your safe and warm cockpit to chance a fall at the earth. Parachutes have saved the lives of thousands of airmen from their falling aircraft. However, in the early days of powered flight, such a luxury wasn't always available. Or was it? There is a belief that during the Great War, or World War I, that pilots never carried parachutes to save them should their nimble biplanes be cut out of the sky. Now, this is supposedly all on the shoulders of high command. The thought was that parachutes would turn pilots into cowards who would jump from their powered kites at the first sign of danger. That being said, you'll be surprised to know that there is really more to it than just the words of a stuffy general. I'm Falcon, and in association with Native Oak Collaborations and Brandon F. himself, we're turning the clock back to 1918 as we delve into the truth about parachutes in World War I. This video is a collaboration where armchair historians like yours truly are coming together and busting history myths in a series called History Matters. Make sure you check out the link to the playlist in the description below for other content like this. To fully grasp the importance of the parachute, we're not looking at the 20th or even the 19th century, but the Renaissance. Some guy you've probably never heard of named Leonardo da Vinci sketched a pyramid-shaped parachute in his journal. Aside from the unconventional shape of the chute, it did have the modern hallmark of the passenger dangling beneath it via cables. Now, it's unknown if the da Vinci parachute was ever built, let alone tested. The first successful test of a parachute came in 1783, when French aeronaut Louis-Sébastien Lenormand leapt from Montpellier Observatory. Having survived the ordeal, Lenormand's use case for the parachute was for people to escape from tall, burning buildings. Lenormand is the first person to actually coin the term parachute, which is a contraction of the Latin word para, which means to resist or be against, and the French word chute, which means to fall. In these terms, parachute literally means fall resist. It makes sense to me. There were a few other contenders developing chutes of their own, and I do urge you to look into them as well, because they really have some interesting ideas, stories, and designs that lie a little bit out of scope of this video. The parachute evolved over time, moving from a rigid framed arrangement to something more compact. As parachutes and airships became popular in the 19th century, non-rigid silk chutes came onto the scene. They were typically packed into metal canisters fixed to the aircraft. Fixed-wing aircraft became a reality in 1903, where space was really a premium. This led Austro-Hungarian tailor Franz Reichelt to design clothing that could deploy in a similar manner to a chute. On February 4th of 1912, the Flying Tailor, as he was called, took to the Eiffel Tower to test his parachute suit for the first time. Contrary to the expectations of the viewers, Reichelt was not going to test a dummy in the suit, but make a leap himself. This didn't end well for the Flying Tailor, for as he leapt from the tower, the parachute failed to deploy and he fell 187 feet to his demise. The event was filmed as it happened, and the clip was shown in theaters the next day during news broadcasts. Of course, I can't really show it here due to its graphic nature. On a brighter note, less than a month later in March of 1912, Albert Berry made the first successful parachute jump from a plane in Jefferson, Missouri. The parachute pack was contained in a metal canister beneath a biplane. Berry jumped from a trapeze bar in the wing and his falling weight deployed the parachute after a 500-foot freefall. Canister-based parachutes became a sort of standard for deployment, which is still a far cry from the modern packs you see today on a flyer's chest or back. Things began to change in 1914, of course, when war were declared. The Great War, spawned by a geopolitical nightmare built up over the course of a century, started on July 28, 1914, when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. For more information on that mess, check out the YouTube channel The Great War, which covers the entire conflict from start to finish as it happened. What we're focusing on today is the air combat that developed from the war. For the first time, aeroplanes were used by both sides, first starting off as recon assets. At first, things were pretty cordial, with pilots not paying much attention to the other side. Now, in the beginning, pilots didn't carry parachutes as they really weren't needed. Planes weren't even being shot down yet. As the war developed, pilots began shooting at one another, first with pistols, then rifles, then eventually machine guns. As the newly dubbed fighting aeroplanes became more numerous, so too did the amount of casualties. Still not carrying any parachutes, pilots in the early and mid part of World War I had few options if they were going to go down. Forcing the plane down into a crash landing was the ideal outcome, but oftentimes planes would lose their wing or burst into flames, preventing this. In such cases, when death was inevitable, pilots would sometimes jump into freefall or turn their service pistols on themselves rather than face the flames licking at them. It was really brutal shit. At the same time, observation balloon crews, often a choice target for fighting planes, were able to escape death by using canister or bag-held parachutes. As simple as these parachutes were, they were extremely effective at saving the lives of artillery observers. So why weren't these primitive parachutes used on aircraft? I've often heard that higher-ups in the Royal Flying Corps and the US Army Air Service kept parachutes out of the hands of their pilots so they'd fight harder and did not abandon their aircraft when under fire. Despite the perpetuation of this idea, RAF Vice Marshal Arthur Gold Lee, a Great War aviator himself, had examined the British War Office records and found no written documentation to support this claim. That being said, I don't doubt that such a stance was likely taken on by some Entente higher-ups. After all, these are the same kind of men who claim that machine guns were ungentlemanly despite their effectiveness. Even so, there are no records that state any particular man ordered parachutes not be issued. What I can find concrete evidence on is how impractical installing early parachutes onto aircraft would have been. Even the effective canister parachutes in use by balloon crews could easily get tangled in a falling and spinning airplane, dragging the pilot to his doom. Giving air crews backpack or chest-mounted parachutes was nigh impossible as well, as most aircraft cockpits in the 1910s were extremely small, preventing any additional cargo. Even if they made the cockpits larger, they would still end up being too large for anyone not bringing a parachute, which would just be another problem. Another issue is that most fighters of the era required space for a fuel tank which would be near the cockpit. Adding room would reduce the amount of fuel carried. The Germans did find a stopgap solution in 1918. Otto Heinecke invented a compact static line parachute to be installed in Albatros and Fokker fighters. A cable was affixed to the pilot throughout his flight, and if he had to bail out, all he would have to do is ensure the cable wasn't tangled and leap from the aircraft. The force of the pilot falling away would yank the cable and deploy the parachute. It wasn't perfect. The parachuter's static line could easily get entangled in the fighter's tail or wings, but it was the first production chute option deployed en masse. The first recorded use of the Heineke parachute came in June 1918, when Helmut Steinbrecher escaped from his Stricken Falls D3. He wouldn't be the last German pilot to escape death, however, as Germany's top surviving ace, Ernst Udet, would bail out from his Fokker D7. His parachute opened less than 100 feet from the ground where he suffered a broken ankle, but he did survive. Udet would go on to claim 62 confirmed victories by the war's end. Post-war, Udet would join the Nazi Party and push for the implementation of dive bombing tactics for the Luftwaffe. For the less informed, dive bombing involves putting a light bomber into a steep dive at up to 80 degrees or more to more accurately hit a target versus level bombing. And if you don't mind, I'm going to go out on a tangent because I want to shed some light on Udet's later career and talk shit about Nazis. The oh-so-mighty Stuka dive bomber, beloved by many of Arabu, was built around a strike profile developed by the Interwar Royal Air Force and U.S. Army. Army Air Corps Colonel Billy Mitchell was able to demonstrate the accuracy of dive bombing by sinking multiple decommissioned warships. Later on, he used level bombers to destroy SMS Ostfriesland and decommissioned US Navy battleships. Udet was so inspired by the dive bomb concept to the point where he convinced Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring to purchase 2 American Curtiss Hawks. It was the light Yankee fighter which he used to demonstrate the bombing techniques to Adolf Hitler. Anyway, my point is that I've had many a conversation where the misinformed claim that dive bombing was a native thing to Germany, which just is not true. After that, Udet became an alcoholic due to the stresses of Nazi life, and upon the launch of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, which he knew would end the downfall of the Reich, he took his own life. My goal of this video is to better explain the complexities of parachute use in the Great War. So often has it been said that it was merely generals sending men to their deaths in the grim hope that they would fight to the bitter end, but it truly was more than that. The parachute was a brand new technology at the time, and implementing it wasn't as simple as just strapping one on. It took experiences in war and improvements for both parachute and airplane technology to bring us to where we are today. In 1919, the first modern parachute as we know it was developed by Lloyd Smith. Smith's design was compact enough to fit into a backpack that was relatively flush with the body. Instead of a static line system pulling the parachute out from a casing, the new model was opened via a ripcord that could be activated once the pilot was a safe distance from the falling plane. Dubbed Airplane Parachute Type A, Smith's design laid the groundwork for all subsequent personal parachutes. And even today, echoes of the design are seen in almost every modern backpack parachute. Well, I think it's about time I pack this up. You know, get it? Like packing a parachute.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
If you like the video, you know the whole liking and subscribing thing, and it really does help me out. I've got a Patreon where I post high-resolution versions of the thumbnails and a few other goodies. As an amateur historian, I know I'm not always going to get everything right, and that's where your comments come in. If you think I was wrong or have any suggestions, I want to learn just as much as you do. Once again, Hellion was instrumental in the art assets I used in almost every video. A special thanks goes out to Native Oak and Brandon F. for bringing all of us historians together for this collaborative project. Make sure you check out the other videos in this playlist, there's a lot of really cool content coming out. Of course, my lovely patrons have once again helped bankroll my work. If you're interested in supporting myself or Hellion, check out our Patreon links. To cap it all off, here's the not needing a parachute. Keep that sun at your back, gang.
All right, boys. Keep your eyes open. Heads up! Better get 5 o'clock high! Hey! Holy shit! This is time! Holy hell! This game's good! Hurry! He's on you! This guy's all over me! I can't shake him! Jesus Christ, sake! Ah!
There's a legend that was whispered among the jet pilots in the Korean War of a lone MiG driver who stood out among the honchos in the communist ranks. Wiping out dozens of American fighters, this red ace struck fear into the hearts of all he faced. Of course, that's the legend. But as we all know, while legends are far from truth, there's always a little grain of fact buried within them. Today we're going to look at the American Air Force's most feared opponent of Korea. Was he a man, or was he a myth? Sit back and relax, guys. It's time to talk about the fabled Casey Jones. In the fall of 1950, the Korean conflict was in full motion. The communist-backed North had nearly captured Seoul twice, but by October, UN forces had pushed the North back across the 38th parallel, the border on which the two nations were divided. B-29 bombers frequently flew into the North on bombing raids, generally unhampered by the North's piston-powered Yak-9s. The Yak-9, codenamed Frank, was a single-seat veteran of the Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets called it. While the Frank was a good fighter during the war, it was long obsolete by 1950, and they were little match to the UN's own F-82 twin Mustangs and early jets like the F-9F Panther and F-80 Shooting Star. Things began to change by November, however, as the bomber formations began to come under attack by stubby, swept-wing jets bearing the markings of the North Korean Air Force. Instead of struggling to climb up to meet the bombers, the Silver Jets were making slashing attacks with ease. They were Soviet-built MiG-15s. It was a hell of a fighter for the time. Packing 37 and 23mm guns, it was ideal for downing American bombers. The large cannons, while having a slower rate of fire than most machine guns, would devastate a fighter in one hit. Not only did the MiG feature a swept-wing pioneered by the Germans in World War II, which cut down on drag at high speeds, the fighter was powered by a copy of the British Rolls-Royce Nene engine. The modern engine, coupled with the innovative wing design, allowed the MiG-15 to outrun and outclimb any American jets in the theater. Now, the first jet versus jet dogfight did end in an American victory, as First Lieutenant Russell Brown downed a MiG-15 in his Shooting Star on November 8th. Even then, it was clear a better counter to the swift and agile MiG would be needed. The answer came in the form of my beloved, the F-86 Sabre. The F-86 was America's most modern fighter at the time and was rushed to the Korean theater in November 1950. Now, the Sabre wasn't a perfect match when pitted against the MiG-15, especially in those hard factors that are often spouted about in the armchair general community these days. So, real quick, let's compare and contrast. The MiG-15 could outclimb and outturn the F-86 thanks to its better thrust and overall lighter build. I mentioned before that the MiG had an array of autocannons which were much bigger than the F-86's 50 caliber machine guns. On paper, the MiG-15 was a better plane, until you get into the secret gadgets the F-86 had. The Sabre, first off, featured nose-wheel steering, which allowed better handling on the ground. The MiG-15 only had differential braking on each main wheel, and even then it had a limited supply of compressed air to allow braking. If you were an inexperienced pilot and wasted all your compressed air, you really couldn't even taxi to take off. The Sabre also had an all-moving tail which allowed control authority at higher speeds. The MiG lacked this, so when getting near Mach 1, supersonic compressibility made the pitch controls nearly useless. The Sabre's 650 caliber guns, while not as effective at nailing bombers, put out more lead than the MiG's cannons, making a sort of buzzsaw effect if a fighter were to fly into the hail of bullets. This increased the probability of a hit. That hail of bullets could also be made more effective by the Sabre's APG-130 radar range and gun sight. Now this is important because there were compensating gun sights going back to World War II. P-51 Mustangs and even the MiG-15 had gyro-guided gun sights. However, they only worked when the pilot dialed in the exact range that they'd be shooting at in order for the gyros to calculate lead. Adding a radar into the MiGs lightened the pilot's load. The F-86 could just point its nose at a MiG, and the gun sight would calculate the lead based on the returns of the radar waves. This allowed the American pilots to get the most out of their 50 cals and make kills at longer ranges or in harder turns. The MiG versus Sabre debate is still ongoing, but the F-86 no doubt leveled the playing field for American pilots. Thanks to the Sabre coupled with well-trained pilots, many of whom flew in World War II, the air war ended with an 8-to-1 kill ratio favoring the Sabre, depending on who you talk to, of course. Official kill ratios are hard to calculate as claimed kills don't often align with the written losses on the other side. This can be attributed to fighters being shot up in gun camera films only to limp home and land successfully. On the other side of the coin, sabers would often pursue MiGs past the Chinese border, which was a big no-no, only to shoot them down. Of course, when this happened, these kills had to be swept under the rug or just flat out ignored. There would often be cases of gun camera films mysteriously disappearing. A notable cover-up was when Navy pilot Royce Williams nailed 4 Soviet MiGs over the Sea of Japan. I covered that here, check it out. The true kill ratio will probably never be cemented given all the gray areas in combat. Regardless, the Sabre and her experienced pilots held superiority. Most of the time. Every now and then, a damned good communist MiG driver would show up, a far cry from the ill-trained North Korean Air Force pilots. Bombers and fighters alike would fall in his wake. A common nickname for these skilled pilots was Honcho, based on the Japanese term for someone who takes charge. But who were the pilots that were so skilled? The Soviet Union's involvement in the Korean War has long been shrouded in mystery outside of the Iron Curtain. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that the Soviets were supplying the North Koreans and Red Chinese with MiG-15s and the infrastructure to support them. But what many don't know, even now, is that Soviet pilots were actually at the helm of a large number of communist Chinese Mark fighters. The Soviets, like the US, had a great number of World War II veterans with years of experience to apply, but couldn't get directly involved in the war lest they end up starting World War III. Instead, the 64th Aviation Corps was formed in October 1950 to covertly plant pilots at MiG bases in Manchuria. While they were instructed to speak either Chinese or Korean, it wasn't long before the weariness of combat forced them back into speaking their native Russian. The UN was listening in, too. In 1952, based on intercepted radio transmissions, it was estimated that 90% of MiG's traffic was Soviet flown. Even so, there was a mystique about the communist pilots. And on June 24, 1951, Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Hinton would come face to face with one hell of a pilot. Hinton had already claimed 2 MiGs and was saddling up for a third over the Yalu River that separated Korea from China. Before he could make his kill, the lieutenant colonel was distracted by an F-86 being trailed by a MiG-15. Its cannons were already firing and shooting the Silver Sabre up. Breaking off, Hinton rolled in to aid his comrade, only for the MiG to break into him head-on. 37mm rounds thumped past Hinton's Sabre by inches as the two merged. A 2-circle fight enveloped, and the 2 jet pilots fought hard in the phone booth, each jockeying for a shot. Eventually, Hinton got off a burst on the MiG driver, who wisely broke and ran rather than lose his life. He ran hard to the north, where he knew American forces couldn't pursue him. Hinton escorted the crippled F-86 home, only to find that its pilot was his friend Glenn Eagleston, a World War II ace with 18.5 kills. A MiG pilot had almost killed an American triple ace, and Hinton speculated that it had to be a Soviet pilot, given the expertise shown. To quote Hinton, "This MiG driver was good, very good. He had been waiting above the engagements between the MiGs and the F-86s. It was a well-known tactic that was commonly used by a single MiG pilot, that we referred to as Casey Jones. Old Casey was an exceptional pilot. His normal procedure was to hit fast from a high perch, diving down on any F-86 that was isolated from the ongoing air battle, quite similar to a tactic used by von Richthofen in the Great War." Casey Jones. That nickname came from an American railway legend. John Luther Casey Jones was a railroader in the 19th century who was known to sit atop train cars to spot any issues with the rails. Despite his keen eye, he was killed in 1900 during a railway crash. It's said that his quick action spared the passengers on the train, who otherwise would have been killed in the accident as his locomotive, the Cannonball, ran into broken-down cars at Vaughn Station in Mississippi. Riding high and eyeing the fighting below earned the MiG driver the moniker Jones once bore. As he rolled in, it became clear that Casey wasn't like any other exceptional MiG drivers. He was even better. An experienced pilot who tore up the skies, his name became popular among the Sabre pilots. So who the hell was Casey Jones? Well, there's no real single answer for that. Many Soviet pilots used similar tactics to those employed by the one who jumped Hinton in '51. That being said, the pilot in that engagement was later identified to be Nikolai Sutyagin, the top-scoring Soviet ace of the war. It might be easy to give him the title, however other honchos have been thought to be Casey Jones as well. Russian ace Yevgeny Papalayev with 19 victories could have been him as well. So could Zhao Baotong of China with 7 kills. Hell, we can't even discount Kim Den-taek of North Korea. What it comes down to is that there were many Casey Joneses. During dogfights where a MiG pilot would stand out or lead a flight with supreme authority, American pilots would dub him Casey Jones. One day Jones might be a Soviet ace, another day he might be Chinese or Korean. They just had to capture the mind of the Americans fighting him. And this is where the curtain falls on the legend of Old Casey. He wasn't just one man, he was an idea. A communist ace that gave the Sabre Boys a run for their money on more than one occasion. A similar legend formed in the story of Colonel Toome in the Vietnam War. In an even more grim situation where the kill ratios were almost 1-to-1, a lone MiG-17 pilot would rip into Air Force and Navy formations. Colonel Toome may have been one man, he may have even been a Russian as well, but just like Casey Jones, he was more likely an idea. The idea of an enemy that could beat us. Thinking about it now, that's part of Western culture. When someone beats us or even comes close to it, we like to put a title on them. We like to think it'd be an individual who stands out among the rest, when it's often really a group of people striking from different flights or even squadrons. We like the idea of a lone ace, be them friend or foe. There's something romantic about it. Look at the Great War and the Red Baron. The Allies were the ones to make Manfred von Richthofen a celebrity almost more than Germany did. It's perpetuated through the media too. Hell, even last year, the Ghost of Kiev, the idea of a lone Ukrainian ace fighting the Russians, was all over the news. And, well, meme boards too, but what's the difference at this point? Even though he didn't exist as an individual, he was an idea. An individual identity to represent dozens of pilots. Just like Casey Jones. We're gonna call it here, I think. Again, props for Hellion for the art assets I use in pretty much every video. I also want to mention that I have a few stickers available in Hellion's online store. They're pretty cool, not that I'm biased. My lovely patrons have once again helped keep a roof over my head, which I always appreciate. A little bit of news regarding that. I've been putting on hangouts every Tuesday in my Discord for the Top Gun graduate patrons. If you want to waste a few hours with me, check out the Patreon and get signed up. We do some digital combat simulator, watch some stuff, and mainly just chill out. Oh, and one more thing before I split. You know that sun boring down on you? Make sure you keep it at your back. Let's talk about Great War aces. Often depicted as knights of the air in media with their dashing scarves and fitted clothing, the glamour often associated with these men came with their noble backgrounds. There was a different kind of ace, however, one not born into grandeur, but out of a blue-collar life. Many have heard of the Red Baron, but less know of the tale of Frank Luke. Over the course of 8 short days in the summer of 1918, Luke would wreak havoc across the Western Front, earning him the nickname the Arizona Balloon Buster. Born in Phoenix, Arizona on May 19, 1897, Frank Luke Jr. spent much of his youth as an outdoorsman, often venturing into the desert with a rifle at his side. During his time at Phoenix Union High School, he was an avid football player. And by football, I mean the real American kind, none of that soccer stuff. This dude was so hard that he finished a game even though his collarbone had been busted in a tackle. Not only that, but he was an avid boxer. A guy's built different, but one of his hobbies is beating the shit out of somebody. It's important to note, though, that aside from his rough side, he apparently did offer dance lessons. Now, I couldn't find out if they were ballroom dancing or anything like that, but it just adds one more layer to the man. After graduation, he became a copper miner, a job that would see him heading to Globe, Arizona for work in 1917. Upon reaching Globe, he learned of America's entry into the Great War. The Great War had already been raging for 3 years, having started in 1914. America, being the melting pot of cultures from England to Germany to Italy, did the only logical thing. It stayed neutral on paper while at the same time supplying the Allies. The Central Powers, headed by the German Empire, fell further out of public favor in 1915. On May 7th of that year, RMS Lusitania was sunk by the German U-boat U-20. On board were 1,959 souls, of which only 761 survived. Among the dead were 128 Americans. By 1917, the US was done with pussyfooting around. The last straw came when the British intercepted communications between Germany and Mexico in the famous Zimmerman telegram incident. The gist is that Mexico was promised American territory if they aided the Central Powers. On April 6th, the United States formally joined the war. With that, let's get back to Frank. Upon learning of the war, Frank wanted to get into the scrap. It wasn't long before he laid eyes on a recruiting poster for the newly formed Army Air Service. The free-spirited Luke was enticed by the idea of flight and signed up. Luke received pilot training in Texas and California and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army. In March of 1918, Luke loaded up onto a troop ship bound for France, a far cry from the Arizona desert he grew up in. The Western Front of the Great War was a cruel and unforgiving place. It's not an exaggeration to call it hell on earth. Muddy trenches, craters to the horizon, and rotting corpses all came wrapped in a snare of barbed wire. Aerial combat in the Great War was brutal, as I said before. In my recent video regarding parachutes in the Great War, one of the comments mentioned that killing the pilot was the end goal of the dogfight. I won't get into the semantics of that, but I do agree with the sentiment. The pilot in a Spad or a Fokker was exposed without any armor beneath the fighter's fabric skin. Hitting the pilot in a dogfight was just as legitimate as hitting the engine or sawing a wing off. In the close-quarter duels wherein combatants saw each other eye to eye, it was a much less glamorous ordeal than we've often been led to believe. Luke was assigned to the U.S. Army's newly formed 27th Aero Squadron, which was equipped with the French Nieuport 28. Through the month of July, the squadron, based at Saintes in France, learned to fly formation and practice dogfighting. Spirits were dulled as the Nieuport 28 often suffered engine problems, requiring many of the 27th pilots, Frank included, to almost constantly return to Saintes. A hard blow struck the rookie Aero Squadron when on August 1st, 6 pilots were lost to German Fokkers. Everything changed when the 27th transitioned to the new Spad 13. The Spad 13 was America's second aerofighter. Also a French-built aircraft like the Nieuport, the Spad was much faster, heavier, and more rugged. Its inline engine offered a more stable gunnery platform than the more common rotary engines used on the Nieuports and the Fokker DR-1s. Being heavier, the Spad couldn't turn with the more nimble Germans, so its pilots employed boom and zoom tactics, where they would dive onto the enemy and keep running. The later Fokkers wouldn't be able to pursue. A pair of Vickers machine guns were mounted atop the nose of the fighter within reach of the pilot. If the guns were to jam, they could be easily cleared to re-enable firing. The Spad was packed full of the modern amenities of the day as well. An altimeter, airspeed indicator, and even a fuel gauge were among the numerous quality-of-life features in the new fighter. On August 16th, Luke mounted up in his Spad for a combat patrol over enemy lines. It was there he claimed his first kill on a German fighter.
Being way above the formation, I cut my motor and dove down on the rear man, keeping the sun directly behind. Opened fire at about 100 feet, keeping both guns on him within a few feet, then zoomed away. When I next saw him, he was on his back, but looked as though he was going to come out of it, so I dove again, holding both guns on him. Instead of coming out of it, he side-slipped off the opposite side, much like a falling leaf, and went down on his back.
Luke became known as a sort of lone fighter who would break away from the formation to take targets one-on-one. On the ground, his personality was the same. He rarely mingled with the rest of the squadron, instead electing to ride off on a motorcycle to shoot targets for fun. In September of 1918, the 27th Aero Squadron was taken over by Captain Alfred Grant, a stern officer obsessed with discipline. He of course didn't see eye to eye with Luke's cowboy antics. Around that time, the squadron moved from Saintes to Rembercourt near the Marne, and Luke began to build a tight friendship with Lieutenant Joseph Werner, who would often follow the lone wolf into the fireworks. Drachen observation balloons became the primary target of choice for the 27th. Tethered to the ground, balloons were important to down because they were used to spot artillery for the German guns. Downing them would essentially blind the artillery batteries that were so deadly to the French and American forces in the Marne. Luke jumped at the opportunity to turn the tide, and on September 12th, he took off to bust a balloon. Killing a balloon is a bit different than going after a fighter. Instead of hitting something hard like an engine, wing, or pilot, a balloon wouldn't go down immediately with gunfire alone. A .30 caliber round, while deadly to human flesh and machinery, did little other than poke a hole in the fabric on the balloon. The French developed their own method to knock out balloons in the form of Lapierre rockets, which were fired from the wings of biplanes. These did see some success, but the Americans had their own secret balloon killer. Earlier in the war, the French modified their 11mm Gras round from the 19th century to pack incendiary filling. These would ignite fabric and hydrogen on impact. Originally used in modified Hotchkiss guns, the American Colt plant was contracted to build 1,700 Vickers guns chambered in the balloon-busting round. Designated the M1915, a Colt Vickers balloon gun was installed alongside a standard Vickers gun on Luke's plane. Over the German lines, Luke spotted one of the balloons being reeled in by its ground crew. The incendiary rounds made short work of the gas bag, which fell in a fireball. It was his first balloon kill. 2 days later, another balloon fell, and Luke wanted more. He tried to take another aircraft up, however his commanding officer, Grant, ordered him to stay grounded for the day and to write up his combat report. Werner, his wingman, did manage to get up for a second flight, however, and claimed another 2 Fokkers. Luke and Werner were building a legend together as the 2 balloon killers of the 27th. The next day, on the 15th, Luke claimed another 2 balloons, while Werner cleared his tail of 2 Fokkers. Once again, Werner kept pace with the Arizona boy, downing another 2 Draken balloons himself. The 2 quickly became the terrors of the Western Front, and that evening, Luke wanted to go up again for yet another sortie. During daylight attacks, he noted that fire from Archie anti-aircraft guns was extremely thick around the balloons. But what about a night attack? At dusk on the 15th, Luke took off from Rembercourt to test his theory. He caught sight of a balloon near the flashes of an artillery position and promptly burned it. Dodging and weaving past Archie fire, Luke ended up getting lost on his way back home and set down near a French farm just before midnight. It really was a close shave. The next morning, he returned to Rembercourt to find Werner waiting for him. The 2 had accomplished what few others had. Werner had downed 3 planes and 3 Draken, while Luke had nailed 6 balloons all in the course of 72 hours. The Germans became extremely wary of launching balloons and would hastily reel them back in at the first sight of an enemy aircraft. 3 more balloons yet fell to the Luke and Werner show, which was witnessed by Colonel Billy Mitchell, who was visiting Rembercourt. Frank Luke and Joe Werner were quickly becoming the most valuable pilots in the Air Service's ranks. Eddie Rickenbacker, a fellow ace in the 94th Aero Squadron, had this to say about them.
There was a curious friendship between Luke and Werner. Luke was an excitable, high-strung boy, and his impetuous courage was always getting him into trouble. He was extremely daring and perfectly blind and indifferent to the enormous risks he ran. Werner's nature, on the other hand, was quite different. He had just one passion, and that was his love for Luke. He followed him around the aerodrome constantly. When Luke went up, Werner usually managed to go along with him. On these trips, Werner acted as an escort or a guard, despite Luke's objections. On several occasions, he had saved Luke's life. Luke would come back to the aerodrome and excitedly tell everyone about it, but no word would Werner say on the subject. Werner hovered in the air above Luke while the latter went in on the balloon. If hostile airplanes came up, Werner intercepted them and warded off the attack until Luke had finished his operations. These 2 pilots made an admirable pair for this work, and over a score of victories were chalked up for 27th Squadron through the activities of this team.
September 18th, 1918. Luke had already downed 2 Draken that morning while on patrol with Joe, who was flying top cover. As he pulled away from the second dirigible, a formation of Fokker D-7s ambushed Werner. The Fokker D-7 was the most advanced German fighter of the war and was more than a match for the Spad. Unlike the older Fokker DR-1s or D-6s, the D-7 had an inline engine and could run down a Spad in a shallow dive. Despite being a rugged fighter like the Spad, it could still turn inside it, maintaining the classic Fokker maneuverability. The balloon-busting duo's situation was made worse as they clapped eyes on the attackers. The lead fighter bore the skull and crossbow marking of Georg von Hantelmann, a German ace with 15 kills, including American Dave Putnam, a veteran of the French Lafayette Escadrille. Hantelmann slid behind Joe's tail and shattered his Spad in a cold, calculated diving attack. Before Frank could retaliate, the snaps of bullets alerted him to 2 more D7s on his own tail. Luke was enraged and broke into the oncoming Germans. In a head-on pass, Frank's Vickers guns chattered away at the oncoming German. The round struck home, killing the pilot instantly. A quick stomp on the rudder brought Luke's guns to bear on the pursuer's wingman, which also fell and crashed into the countryside. 2 bandits were down, but Luke was enveloped in a furball of the Fokkers. He was able to knock out a 3rd D7 before an opportunity to run for home came. He unloaded his aircraft and dove for the safety of the Allied lines. Though he downed 5 enemy aircraft in less than 10 minutes, a feat which made him America's first ace in a day, as well as the top scoring ace, he was inconsolable over the loss of Joe. The one man Frank let fly with him was dead, and he was alone once again. And with that, he internalized the pain. Even a 6-day furlough in Paris did little to bring out any emotion from the ace. His last letter to his mother was as follows.
September 25th, 1918. Dear Mother, I've not written for some days now, on account of being so busy, as no doubt you've already heard. This is only a line to let you know that I'm okay. Now, Mother, remember that I have passed the dangerous stage of being a new hand at the game, so don't worry, for I now know how to take care of myself. Love to all, Frank.
The waning days of September brought Luke back to the front and another Fokker down in flames, but the 27th lost another pilot, Lieutenant Ivan Roberts. Further spiraling into a depression, Luke began to venture out on patrols alone as though he were going to keep killing balloons until he was brought down himself. On September 28th, he launched without authorization to strike a balloon hovering above Bethansville, enraging Major Grant. After reporting the kill to his commanding officer, Luke left in his Spad, again without authorization, to spend the night with a French unit near the front. Grant had enough. He intended to arrest Luke once he returned, but before he could do so, for a 3rd time, Frank was able to slip past the Major's grasp and into the sky again. It was September 29th, and Luke's lone Spad made a pass over an American company. As his plane blotted out the setting sun, a note tied to a weight fell to the Yanks. Frank was never going to be taken alive, either by the enemy or his own commanding officer. As twilight neared, 3 balloons exploded, one by one, casting a hellish orange glow over the German lines. It was the last time Frank Luke would ever be seen alive by the Americans. It's not exactly clear what happened to the Arizona balloon buster on his final mission, but French villagers near Moreau report that he downed 2 more Fokkers in addition to the Drakens. During his rampage, Luke allegedly strafed German trenches back and forth until a lucky round struck him. Severely wounded, the Spad was put down behind enemy lines. As the Germans moved in to capture him, he drew his pistol, a .45 Colt, and fired on the soldiers. As the legend goes, a gunfight broke out, and while Luke fell to a shot from a Mauser, his body, still clutching his empty pistol, was surrounded by 7 German corpses. Now, the latter part of that is up for debate, and it was most likely fabricated for the papers of the time. We do have enough evidence to know that Frank did fight back instead of being taken prisoner, however. The Arizona balloon buster was dead, but has never been forgotten. He was an ace who struck fear into the hearts of not only pilots but balloon crews. In all, 18 aircraft, 14 of which were balloons, were burned to the ground in a short time in the air. That's not even including the 2 Fokkers he allegedly downed on his final mission. Luke was posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, and in 1941, Luke Field, now Luke Air Force Base, was named for him. Hell, you can even see a replica of his Spad at Phoenix's Sky Harbor Airport. All the awards, monuments, and displays aside, I think Luke's legacy can be summed up in the words of one of his fellow Air Service pilots. Eddie Rickenbacker, who would go on to survive the war as America's top ace, said this about him.
He was the most daring aviator and the greatest fighter pilot of the entire war. His life is one of the brightest glories of our air service. He went on a rampage and shot down 14 enemy aircraft, including 10 balloons, in 8 days. No other ace, even the dreaded Richthofen, had ever come close to that.
I think that simple summary sums up Luke in the best way possible. This one's not just for Frank, but for Werner too. As always, a special thanks goes out to my patrons, once again keeping a roof over my head. It's because of all the support you give, and blah blah blah, you get the picture. Subscribe, support Hellion, check out Part-Time Explorer's channel, he's the one who supplied the Lusitania footage for this. Came out great, thank you Tom. Also, check out this fan art people have been doing for me, it's pretty sweet. Son, back. Later. Aerial gunnery in the days of the Second World War was one of the hardest things to train for. The crews of Allied bombers had to rely on films and crude towed targets to practice for the real thing. Of course, the real thing was much more unpredictable, fast, and deadly. Gunning down an incoming German or Japanese fighter to save yourself and your crew is a far cry from the simplistic training done in the States. They could come in at any angle, at any speed, and if you weren't fast enough, you'd find yourself dangling from silk. If you were lucky. The Army Air Corps had to find a better way to train their gunners to ease their trial by fire. The hardy P-63 King Cobra was selected for the task, which was to be shot at with live ammunition by bomber crews. The 63s were painted in a blaze orange and modified to take the punishment from fire slung at them from their fellow Americans. A notable modification, a hit indicator light on the nose, earned the project its nickname, Pinball. Established in June 1941, before the US was even involved in World War II, the first school for flexible gunnery sprouted up in Las Vegas. Despite being a desert environment, the school could rely on clear skies and a stable air temperature year-round. As the war grew the need for more aerial gunners, other schools began to open across the country. 6 locations opened up like chain restaurants from Arizona and Texas to Florida. I can only imagine how much of a pain in the ass it was to try and instruct students through the hurricane season, but I digress. World War II saw a new kind of aerial combat. Unlike the Great War, massive formations of bombers formed the backbone of the strategic bomber concept. Bomber forces could strike deep within enemy territory and destroy military targets, infrastructure, and supply lines. In the European theater of operation, the US Army Air Corps took on the daylight bombing duties over occupied Europe. Initially, the bomber forces were unprotected as it was thought that they packed enough firepower on flexible turrets to deter any interceptor attacks. By 1942, however, it was clear that bomber attrition was too costly. Not only were the unescorted bombers easy pickings for the Luftwaffe, the gunners had little luck in hitting the incoming fighters. Training aerial gunnery in a realistic way was nigh impossible in the 1940s. There were no simulators that could offer a convincing training course. Hell, the best gunnery schools could think up at first was to have students shoot at clay pigeons with shotguns. I actually used to do this as a hobby, and given my personal experience, I can imagine it built up the fundamentals needed to lead targets, but probably wouldn't do much to translate into machine gun firing at 30,000 feet. As time went on, other training methods came onto the scene, such as the Waller Gunnery Simulator, which projected film of incoming enemy aircraft. Of course, it was still a far cry from the real thing. Even towed targets were tested, but it wasn't enough. A new technique was needed, something more real. Enter Major Cameron Fairchild and Paul Gross. In a desperate bid to aid in gunnery training, Major Fairchild, then stationed at the Harlingen Gunnery School in Texas, wrote several universities. He had a concept in mind that would involve shooting at real piloted aircraft. Insane, right? Well, not if the projectiles fired were designed to not cause any harm to the fighter. Paul Gross, the director of scientific research at Duke University, took on the challenge. Several materials were tested for a projectile that would shatter on impact with the intent to not even so much as scratch the plane's paint job. Working closely with Marcus Hobbs, a chemistry professor, Gross tested their frangible projectiles with .22 caliber rifles. A glass and bakelite composite proved promising. By July of 1942, the concept moved forward into the development of a full-scale rifle round that could be fired from a .30 caliber machine gun. For the next 2 years, the scientists worked closely with Fairchild, who spearheaded the project for the Army Air Corps. In 1943, the first molds for producing the frangible rounds were developed by the Bakelite Corporation, which greatly helped the manufacturing process. Until this point, all of the test rounds had been handmade. Officially dubbed Ball, Frangible, Caliber 30, T-44, the crumbling round packed a lower powder charge than the standard .30-06 round. To allow a machine gun to cycle the experimental ammunition, Duke scientists under Gross and Hobbs modified a .30 caliber with a gas-powered piston booster at the muzzle. This would increase the amount of gases running back into the machine gun to allow proper operation. That alone would make for an interesting video. I'm sure Forgotten Weapons would love to cover something like that if they can get their hands on one. While the .30 caliber machine gun was smaller than the .50 cals on B-17s and B-24s, the operation of the gun was the same and the ballistics of the rounds scaled well enough to offer an effective analog. The gun and the ammunition was ready, and multiple examples were mounted onto a YB-40 nicknamed Pea Shooter. But what would the target be? The first real-world test saw an A-20 Havoc, Alclad NAG, making runs past the Pea Shooter. Crewed by Chuck Everett and J.B. Rowan, the NAG's pilots were only told that they would be testing new ammunition. It was never fully expressed to them that they would be the target until after they had volunteered for the project. The first trial saw the NAG peppered by frangible rounds, which successfully shattered and left no visible damage on the plane. The second day, the A-20 repeated the run on the YB-40, only for an engine to cut out. Luckily, Everett was able to limp the A-20 home and land at a divert field. The close shave would have ended the frangible bullet experiments then and there, if the accident was actually caused by one of them. A close look over the aircraft showed that the engine stoppage was caused by an unrelated mechanical fault. After more testing with the A-20, the decision was made to go ahead with a better fighter analog. The success of the Alclad NAG experiments landed frangible bullet training as part of the Flexible Gunnery School's syllabus. The A-20, however, needed to be replaced with a more nimble fighter which, at the time, needed to be strong enough to take the beating the NAG could. They may have been frangible rounds, but the experimental ammunition could still cause damage if it hit the right spot. There were fears that the pilot could be hit as well as the softer engine components. The fighter to take the onslaught would need to have a configuration ideal for, well, being shot at. The answer came in the form of the P-63 King Cobra. The P-63 was the evolution of the earlier P-39 Era Cobra developed by the Bell Company in Buffalo, New York. While the P-39 didn't see much service in the US, having been considered obsolete by the war's outset, the little fighter was beloved by the Soviets, who made great use of them against the Axis. The P-39 had a very unique arrangement. The Allison V-12 engine was actually positioned behind the pilot, which meant the propeller's drive shaft ran just beneath the pilot's legs. The placement of the engine allowed for a 37mm cannon to be installed in the nose, with the muzzle resting in the prop hub. The cannon was used to great effect on the Eastern Front, allowing the Soviets to pop lightly armored vehicles and entrenchments. There's talk that they were able to kill tanks with it too, however, any information regarding that is pretty dubious, but we'll get into that sometime. The cockpit was unique as well. The pilot sat low under the canopy and entered the craft via side doors much like a car. Despite the lack of success in the Army Air Corps, the boys over at Bell felt that they could improve on the design. On December 7, 1942, 1 year to the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Bell's new XP-63 took to the air. A series of superchargers and a 4-bladed propeller added to the King Cobra allowed it to operate effectively at higher altitudes, and armament improvements brought it back in line with more modern aircraft. Instead of the two 30 cals, two 50 cals, and the 37 Mike, The King Cobra was armed with 4 50 cals, which would increase firepower while at the same time making procuring ammunition easier. The beast of a plane retained the autocannon in the nose, which was most welcomed by the European allies we were exporting to. The souped-up Cobra could also carry 1,500 pounds of ordnance in its wings. Despite the improvements, the Army Air Forces never adopted the King Cobra for frontline combat duties, since we already had the P-51s and 47s. Honestly, the situation made the 63 all the better for Major Fairchild's project. Using the P-63 wouldn't detract from any of the frontline fighter supplies or maintenance personnel. The P-63 was also an ideal candidate as it looked very similar to a German Bf-109 from the front. The rear engine arrangement also meant that it would be protected from any incoming fire from head-on. You can't just throw a stock King Cobra into the mix, however. Modifying the King Cobras was a bit of an arduous task. Initially, 5 P-63As were acquired by the gunnery schools, who began tinkering on them by July 1944. The King Cobras, redesignated RP-63A, R meaning restricted from combat, had all of their armor and weapons stripped from them. The Sperry Gyroscope Company developed an intricate radiosonic device intended for picking up detonations in internal combustion engines. The same system was adapted for use underneath the skin of the RP-63 as a sort of nervous system. Any impact of a frangible round could be detected and send a signal to a bright red light in the nose of the plane. The light, having taken the place of the cannon, looked much like a light in a pinball machine, earning the project its title. A hit counter in the Cobra's cockpit would also notify the pilot of any hits. In addition to the quasi-nervous system in the newly dubbed pinball, additional armor plating was positioned around the aircraft to protect the pilot and vital flight surfaces. Finally, each one of the RP-63s was painted blaze orange, as was the custom of experimental aircraft in the 1940s. 95 other P-63As and 200 C models would receive the same pinball treatment. Eventually, the program became so successful that a dedicated model, the RP-63G, was built from the ground up just for the pinball duty. In addition to the nose light, the later pinball Cobras would have wingtip lights added to further notify the trainee gunner of a hit. Throughout 1944 and 1945, flexible gunnery schools across the United States fired 13 million rounds of frangible bullets. Both the round and the modified King Cobras did their jobs, and surprisingly, not a single pilot was killed in the hazardous duty. Despite the success of the technology, it is up for debate how helpful the training regimen was given the war ended in the middle of 1945. After the war, the Strategic Air Command maintained the flexible gunnery training program until 1947, when the cost of the program was deemed too expensive. In the end, all of the Pinball 63s were mothballed. Improvements in technology meant that defensive aircraft guns were obsolete, and most Cold War bombers reduced their gun batteries to just the tail position. I did a video covering the last of the tail gunners here. I think you'll like it if you enjoyed this sort of prequel. As for the last of the P-63s, there are very few still around, let alone ones that we know for a fact were part of the pinball program. Sadly, a P-63F owned by the Commemorative Air Force was lost along with its pilot, Craig Hutane, in a mid-air collision with B-17 Texas Raiders. My podcast co-host Anna Markey did well to explain the incident, and I'll make sure the link is in the description. Pinball was a forgotten operation with a forgotten plane, but it left its mark on history. It further advanced how training regimens are formed in the military, showed how high-tech avionics can be installed in research aircraft for experiments, and built military and academic ties. If you want to learn more about pinball, I highly recommend Operation Pinball by Ivan Hickman. He's one of the original guys who served at Kingman Gunnery School during the pinball days. It's been a hell of a source of information, and honestly, it's amazing what you'll find in a book that you can't find online. Thanks to Ghoul for sending me a copy and letting me know about the project. This is all because of you, man. Now, I'm thinking of doing an experiment down the road if this video gets off the ground. I'd like to get some T-44 ammunition of my own to test against aircraft skin. I'd really like to see how the frangible rounds work in person. Of course, if I do this, I'll be sure to film it for, scientific purposes. Now, the ammunition isn't cheap, it's like $3 or $4 a round, and that's where you guys would come in. If you're interested in helping me out on future projects, my Patreon is in the description. I'd really appreciate the support. That being said, thanks to everybody who's already supporting me. It means a lot more than you know. As always, keep that sun on your back. See you around, guys. For over a decade, the Ace Combat fandom has had a vendetta against a game in the series. Even uttering its name opens up a flurry of controversy. I'm breaking the mold for this one. I know. Oh, Falcon, you're a history channel, you don't review games. Baby, it's my show. Real talk, this game is a bit of an exception because I want to cover something that really hit me during my formative years. Ace Combat Assault Horizon is a 2011 game released for PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and later on, Steam, and honestly, I don't really see why it's so hated.
I still keep talking, Colonel.
Roger that.
Well, okay, I see why it's hated, but I think it's time we took an honest look at it. Ace Combat Assault Horizon, or simply Horizon as I'll call it, has its roots all the way back not in 1995 when Ace Combat was released for PlayStation, but a humble 1992 arcade flight simulator known as Air Combat. Back in 1988, the Namco video game company implemented its System 21 graphics engine for arcade cabinets. Starting with the game Winning Run, the System 21, also known as Polygonizer, pioneered three-dimensional graphics rather than the oh-so-common sprites seen in most arcade games. Polygonizer games included Winning Run, Driver's Eyes, and Galaxian 3, among others. In 1992, Air Combat was released internationally in arcades. The game was simple. The player who flies an F-16 is tasked with defending his or her base from an incoming air raid. The game took a departure from other aviation arcade games by putting the player in the Viper's cockpit, which depicted a realistic heads-up display. A targeting cursor would lash onto an enemy to depict a missile lock. From there, the player only had to... Did that fucking thing launch countermeasures? Yeah, for such a simple game, Namco really did put detail into how the AI enemies fought and defended themselves. They would jink and evade, and even launch chaff to confuse players' missiles. This is all back in the early 90s when most other flying games were, non-existent really. Save, of course, for the fast-paced Sega Afterburner series. Sure, you had PC flight simulators, but this one was different. Anyone with a pocket full of change could sit down in the detailed ejection seat replica and become a fighter ace. 2 years later, Namco released a sequel, Air Combat 22, which was named for the upgraded System 22. The game featured 3 aircraft to choose from and had a more Top Gun-inspired soundtrack. Fun fact, this was the first game in the series I ever played at our local arcade. I must have been like, 5 or so, which was 25 years ago? Oh my god. Let's shift over to home consoles for a bit. The brand new PlayStation had come onto the scene and Namco wanted to adapt Air Combat 22 to the console. Unfortunately, just porting the game wasn't as easy as they thought at first. Namco elected to develop an entirely new game from the ground up that had better optimization. In June 1995, Ace Combat was released in Japan and later released as Air Combat internationally. The game featured a paper-thin plot loosely inspired by the manga Area 88, where the player controls a mercenary force attempting to liberate a small island nation taken over by terrorists. Killing enemies would net the player money which could be used to purchase aircraft or pay wingmen to fly alongside them. Ace Combat 2, released in 1997, improved on the first game's formula, introducing better AI, better terrain textures, and a more detailed plotline that gave us the first glimpse of the Eugene continent. For the most part, save for Ace Combat 3, which I'll cover in a video of its own, the following games stayed true to the format. Blow shit up, make money, and then blow shit up in a better plane. Ace Combat 4, 5, and 0 are heralded as classics on the PlayStation 2, but by 2007, with the release of Ace Combat 6, the formula was beginning to get stale. Ace Combat 6 had the unfortunate fate of being released solely on the Xbox 360 and only sold 436,000 copies. For reference, Ace Combat 04 released over 2.6 million copies. While the gameplay itself was excellent, critics found the plotline very much a rehash of previous games. TLDR, you play as a fighter ace helping to liberate your homeland, and through your actions, the course of the war changes. Namco, now merged with Bandai, set out to make the next Ace Combat game a bit different. Honestly, they had to. Releasing more of the same without significant changes would be suicide for the series. Using the Ace Combat 6 engine, Namco Bandai created a proof-of-concept gameplay trailer involving an F-22 Raptor engaging Sukhois over Grace Maria. The concept featured cinematic camera movements following missiles and gunfire. The F-22 could perform automated countermaneuvers via button presses. And finally, for the first time in an Ace Combat project, we got to see an actual damage model on the Su-33s. While crude by today's standards, Vulcan fire could be seen violently disassembling the target until the point of breakup. It's pretty awesome, actually. Project Aces decided to move forward by making a full game around the concept. Writing the story would be American techno-thriller author Jim DeFelice. The game would be set in the real world versus Strange Real, a choice many fans would have issue with. Namco Bandai, however, saw an opportunity to model real-world environments like Moscow, Paris, and, Florida. Gameplay would be enhanced from previous entries by adding a dogfight mode feature in which the player could activate a close-in combat minigame to destroy fighters. In addition to the fighter combat so beloved by the fandom, Horizon would include helicopter, bomber, and even an AC-130 gunship mission. Well, what could go wrong? In October 2011, Ace Combat Assault Horizon released worldwide, and good lord, the fandom hated it.
What the fuck happened? Hey!
I'll cover this one real quick because everyone complains about it. Assault Horizon, like the rest of the series, prided itself on cutting-edge graphics. I'll be honest, even today it looks damned good. The textures are a bit dated now, but the explosions, steel carnage, and even the map environments still look fantastic a decade later. Unlike Ace Combat 6, Horizon really has dumbed the missile tracking physics down, and the gun acts like a super soaker in standard combat. Hell, you don't even get a tracking gun sight unless you delve into the core gimmick of the game. Dogfight mode! Okay, so this is going to be a lot to talk about. Dogfight mode, or DFM, was Project Ace's way to highlight the damage models present in all enemy aircraft. Instead of just locking onto a target and firing like previous titles, DFM locks your fighter in a close-up sort of mini-game in which you can attack with precision gun, missile, or special weapon attacks. The close-in assault sort of turns the game into a rail shooter. If the enemy banks hard, you'll sort of automatically follow them. You can break the DFM by pulling away or if another enemy gets on your tail, however. Calling back to the original Project Aces concept, enemy aircraft would try to use counter-maneuvers to evade. The player could react with a sort of counter-counter against them in a bullet time sequence, and it would be really satisfying to see the enemy get ripped up with a gunshot, but you've got to be quick. In addition, the enemy fighter could use dogfight mode on the player, who themselves could pull some crazy Hollywood Colbert maneuver to evade.
Target down.
DFM was met with severe criticism as many enemy aircraft, labeled target leads, could only be killed using this gimmick in a long, drawn-out and scripted event. I mean, Christ, look at all the rounds I'm pumping into this dude. Just fucking die, please! One of the biggest criticisms with this game was the scripted events, most notably the final battle, which really dragged and didn't offer the player much control in a flight action game. DFM also had a few moments where it would drag you into the ground if you weren't careful, a surefire way to ruin a perfect mission run. Interspersed in the campaign are stupid little quick-time events, of which only 2 determine if you live or die. It's kind of a pointless addition in my opinion. Aside from the DFM debacle, you've got... Okay, so the 2 helicopter missions are pretty straightforward. You're down low in an Apache shooting armor, other aircraft, and infantry. Crashing into objects is extremely forgiving as you just end up butting against a surface and bouncing off. You don't even take any damage. Honestly, there's not much to write home about these missions. They're basically just 3-dimensional first-person shooters. Instead of jumping over walls, you just fly over them. I do love how when you counter an incoming missile, though, the helicopters fucking barrel roll. It's top-tier style points. There are 2 missions where you man a minigun on a Black Hawk as well, and it's really nothing too intricate, but it's a fun little time killer. Next. There's one bomber mission involving a low-altitude interdiction mission. You can fly either the B-1 Lancer or the B-2 Spirit and stroke your enemies with a throbbing cock of freedom in the form of hundreds of dumb bombs raining down. It's honestly really awesome. It uses an air-to-ground version of DFM called Airstrike Mode. It's basically a corridor that lines up, allowing you to inflict increased damage on a specific lineup of targets. It shows up in the main missions as well, and works a bit better than the DFM for the most part. Moving on. Okay, so hear me out on this one. Imagine you're a game developer in the late 2000s. Call of Duty 4 has just come out and was a shit-hot release. One famous mission set the stage for any military shooter coming out for the next 5 years. Death from Above. The infamous mission puts the player in the cockpit of an AC-130 gunship escorting ground forces. Now, the AC-130 is a favorite of mine. It's a modified Hercules cargo plane with numerous guns mounted onto the port side to provide air support. It's the only aircraft I know packing a 25mm equalizer, a 40mm Bofors, and a 105mm cannon in a single package. Basically, you put it in a left-hand orbit over a target and rain death. Of course, every game dev needed to use such a masculine rain of death in their badass shooter. Modern Warfare 2, Modern Warfare 3, Hawks 2, Zombie Gunship, Toy Soldiers Cold War, and yes, Ace Combat Assault Horizon all needed to feature this badass platform. And, well, it's a black and white screen for 15 minutes while you shoot white highlighted targets on the ground. It doesn't even affect the plot any. That being said, let's talk about the main story for this game. Unlike other Ace Combat games, the protagonist wouldn't be a faceless, mute pilot, but would be an American Air Force Lieutenant Colonel William Bishop. In the far future year of 2015, the world is in turmoil. The game starts over Miami, Florida, in a furball between American and Russian fighters. Our main character, a human slab of freedom, is the leader of Warwolf Squadron, a special Air Force contingent. Bishop's wingman is top-tier bro Jose Guts Gutierrez. After downing numerous Sukhoi 35s, Bishop is fired on by a shark-mouthed flanker and ejects. Helplessly dangling in his parachute, the shark rams him, and of course it's just a dream and he wakes up in his barracks. The real story picks up in Northern Africa, as NATO Task Force 108, made up of primarily American and French aircraft, attempt to put down an insurrection known as the SRN. With them is a Russian contingent led by General Staglashov, who prefers to do things his own way without any ulterior motives whatsoever. Oh yeah, this game was made in that time period where the world was starting to get cool with Russia again after the Cold War. This is before the whole Crimean invasion of 2014, and of course, well, you know what's been happening in the rest of Ukraine since 2022. You do have an allied Russian squadron, Red Moon, who helps you in various battles over Africa, and its leader, Major Sergei Ilyich, does come off as a bro despite his commander's prick attitude. After Ilyich gets shot down and rescued, it comes to light that a number of advisors aiding the rebels are Russian-speaking, claim which Staglashov, I'm going to call him General Stag from now on, dismisses immediately. This is after 2 nukes that aren't technically nukes, call sign Trinity, are detonated. I think there's actually a combat-approved episode on the Trinity missile. Let's check it out. The EW-1 Trinity is the newest weapon in the Russian arsenal. Based on the venerable Kinzhal hypersonic missile, the Trinity can evade most international treaties while still inflicting the highest amount of damage possible. Trinity is said to be such a devastating weapon that the Russian military has painted them bright red to indicate their destructive nature. Trinity can single-handedly wipe out hundreds of enemy tanks in one blow. Nothing in NATO's inventory can come close. It may surprise the viewer that such a powerful weapon is in such a compact package. Trinity can be mounted to the Su-35 and, of course, the mighty Su-57. If you need to destroy a NATO-backed city block or refugee camp, look no further.
Я над полигоном, и мы ожидаем увидеть испытания Троицы вживую. Пилот уже выпустил оружие. Смотрите, как быстро оно летит. Это невероятно.
After putting down other SRN actions, TF-108 is unsurprisingly blindsided by Stag, who betrays the NATO boys and runs off with his boyfriend, a mysterious Russian ace called Akula. Bishop's fighter gets shot up and he crash lands back at the NATO base, only for a third Trinity warhead to detonate a nearby town. The existence of other Trinity warheads sends TF-108 on a wild goose chase into Dubai, which turns up nothing aside from 6 Tu-95 Bear bombers. If this weren't an ace combat game, those bombers alone would spark an invasion of Russia, just saying. Anyway, around this time, an ultranationalist group in the Russian military launches a coup d'etat to, I think, restore the Soviet Union. It isn't really clear, but they call themselves the New Russian Federation. Basically, you end up with another Russian civil war where you have Russians that help you and Russians you shoot at. Oh look, the Black Sea Fleet being attacked with A-10s. You know, I used to think this mission was the stupidest thing in the world, as attacking a modern naval fleet with low and slow-flying warthogs looks suicidal on paper, but then the sinking of the Moskva happened in 2022, and now this mission just seems a little less dumb. But let's move on. TF-108 pushes into Eastern Europe, into Russian territory, and eventually puts down a missile field with a B-1 bomber strike. During the strike, Major Illich apparently suffers a mechanical issue and disappears on his return to base. Pretty mysterious, I don't know. Soon after, the liberation of Moscow begins with TF-108 at the spearhead. Apache helicopters led by Captain Robinson beat back ground forces while Bishop and the Warwolves clear the skies. All's going well until... you got it, another Trinity. Right into the center of the city. With thousands of casualties being caused by the ultra-nationalist attack, Warwolf Squadron is able to down the other bombers preparing to nuke the city. After the last bomber is knocked out, Bishop comes face to face with Akula once again. A dogfight between the skyscrapers takes the player on a scripted but visually stimulating fight until Akula gets taken down. General Stag, the head of the rebellion, offers to surrender. However, before he can, Akula, having ejected from his flanker, appears and offs the general. Bishop is then briefed on exactly who Akula is. He's Andrei Markov, an ace of the Russian Air Force. Having served in the Bosnian War as a mercenary, he sought revenge on the US after a bombing strike killed his wife, Krista. In a suicidal final attack on America, Markov readies an attack force consisting of himself, a flight of bombers, and countless fighters. First, they strike Miami. Bishop's wingman, Guts, gets hit defending him from a head-on attack by Markov and an Su-57, which strangely echoes his dream. His ejection seat disabled, Guts is ordered by Warwolf 1 to invert so his canopy can get shot off. And for what it's worth, it does work, as stupid as it is. In another head-on pass, Akula's felon gets winged before he runs off like a coward to the north. As Bishop pursues Markov, he comes under attack from Illich. As it turns out, Illich is another traitor who was Akula's wingman in the 90s. I mean, fine. And of course, Illich gets his teeth kicked in and he crashes into a hurricane. Back on the pursuit, Bishop chases Akula all the way to Washington, D.C. It's actually a very impressive opening to the mission as you see dozens of aircraft on each side dogfighting. After killing the rest of Russia's entire flying Tu-160 fleet, Bishop spots Markov carrying Trinity on his wing. Another heavily choreographed dogfight mode segment envelops, and Bishop is able to finally shoot the fucker in the cockpit, ending his shenanigans once and for all.
Markov. He's down.
Wait a second.
Trinity.
Colonel, Trinity is still alive. Destruction of Trinity confirmed. Good job, Colonel. Colonel.
The nightmare's over. Finally.
Colonel!
Warwolf. Go ahead, Magic.
What's your status?
I'm fine, but need to land.
Acknowledged. We'll alert National.
And that's Assault Horizon. It's nothing special. In fact, one could argue it's a paper-thin story serving only to facilitate the gimmicky game mechanics. I can see how one might come to that conclusion too, but what if I told you there was more to Assault Horizon than meets the eye? We all know about the aforementioned criticisms of the game. How DFM is a gimmick, how the plot sucks, etc. But Assault Horizon did quite a few things that Ace Combat games have lacked since. For one, the majority of the campaign is co-op for up to 3 players. No other game in the series save for Joint Assault on the PSP has done that. Joint Assault, while a game special to me for personal reasons, is, well, severely flawed and mostly forgotten. The game also featured great multiplayer modes, including the standard deathmatch mode seen in Ace Combat 7, Capital Conquest, and Domination mode, which was sort of a base capturing mode. Each team would have to take ringed off areas on a map in a similar manner to the old school Star Wars Battlefront. In addition to selecting your aircraft, you have skill sets similar to aircraft sets later on in the series. These could increase your gun damage, missile accuracy, basically standard stuff you would see in Ace Combat 7, but in a system that applies to all aircraft instead of one. And you know what? Even with helicopters, Trinity missiles, and dogfight mode in the mix, it worked. It all came together in a cohesive manner, making for a fast-paced multiplayer experience that, in my opinion, the newest entry, Ace Combat 7, deeply lacks. Horizon also featured full aircraft paint customization. Again, a feature not explored since in a mainline game. It wouldn't be a Horizon match without seeing DLC Idolmaster skins fighting highlighter yellow F-15 Eagles and hot pink MiG-21s with machine gun pods. What it all comes down to is that it was just fun. Core features aside, the Steel Carnage, which spat metal and oil splatters from targeted aircraft, would end up being used as a feature in every main Ace Combat game since. Ace Combat Infinity and 7 both show off damage models pioneered in Ace Combat Assault Horizon with pride. Even 7 has a little you win cutscene every now and then on bosses where you see their shattered fighter blow up and fly off into the distance. A lot of the maps from Horizon would end up in Infinity as well. This would allow players to further experience them in a microtransaction-filled nightmare, of course, but don't worry, I have plans for Ace Combat Infinity. Now, I don't believe in defending movies or games by pointing out fixes or details in other media or what have you. What's in the game is what's in the game. That being said, I did find some interesting iceberg materials for Horizon that you guys might be interested in. According to an interview with Jim DeFelice, originally believed the plot would be set in Strange Reel, but Namco Bandai requested that it be set in our real world. I can only speculate what his original storyline might have been like if William Bishop were, say, an OC in Ace? Jim also wrote a now-forgotten companion piece for the game, The Last Ace. The novel details Bishop's life before the events of Assault Horizon. The main setting of the story has him testing an advanced F-22 variant as he recalls the events of the Bosnia War in which he too was involved, like Markov. As a young pilot, he flew an F-16 with his commander, Colonel Skull Scranton. Throughout the story, Skull ends up downing 5 MiGs over Bosnia, only for his Viper to get hit while egressing. He tries to eject, only for the seat to not fire. Skull inverts his F-16 and orders Bishop to shoot his canopy off, which the young pilot successfully accomplishes. It's a feat Bishop would repeat later, saving his wingman guts in the events of the game. What's different about Skull, however, is that he does get saved by a rescue helicopter, which ends up getting hit by a man-pad, killing all aboard. Honestly, I think that backstory would have been awesome to have show up in Assault Horizon as Bishop's own flashback. I have to wonder if DeFelice ever considered such a plot point that ended up being cut. Jim, if you're watching this, I'd love to talk with you more about the story ideas you had back in the day. It's been over 10 years, so let's hear it. Now, I don't want you guys to think that William Bishop is some kind of deep character. No one is in this story, but I did like seeing the player character having some meaningful friendly dialogue with his wingmen. Assault Horizon is not a deep plot either, but it's honestly a bit of fresh air versus the previous game's failed attempts at writing emotional, anti-war plots and coming off as contrived and cringeworthy. I'm looking at you, Unsung War. Yes, I went there. If we're going to criticize the writing of Assault Horizon, we also have to look at the other end of the writing spectrum. I don't mind a good anti-war story. In fact, I'm a huge fan of writings such as All Quiet on the Western Front and Failsafe. I am going to go on record to say that Ace Combat 5's writing is just forced and bad because it glorifies the player's actions as they wipe out dozens of targets in a single mission, while at the same time giving this preachy war bad message. It comes off as disingenuous to me. In fact, the Unsung War isn't the only one in the series to do this. At least Assault Horizon is honest about what it's trying to do. It's a simple, Modern Warfare-esque action game that was a product of its time. With it came a multitude of innovations that shaped the later entries in the series. Love it or hate it, we wouldn't be where we are in the franchise if Horizon never happened. I mentioned at the beginning that this came out in my formative young adult years, and I'm gonna get a little personal here. I've been playing these games since I was in elementary school, and they just sort of grew up with me. They evolved and grew from their humble origins just like I was. I started with Ace Combat 2, played the butchered Electrosphere, and my grandfather rented Shattered Skies and the Unsung War for me from the local Blockbuster more times than I can count. Ace Combat 0 was the first game I bought with my own money at age 13. And then, 2011 is the year I graduated high school, the same year the game came out. Someone in their early adulthood is still figuring themselves out, and honestly, Assault Horizon was trying to figure out where the franchise would go itself. While the game was far from perfect, so was I. And honestly, I didn't like it all that much at first. I did grow to love it though, as I went to college and played it online with people across the world for hours at a time. It came out in a time where I needed it, and that's really the best way I can describe it. I still can't call Ace Combat Assault Horizon a great game. Actually, it's questionable if it was ever good. Most people I talked to about it always had something to say, good or bad. But whenever they talked about it, they always had a slight smile on their faces. And that, perhaps, may be my answer.